The great citadels that had dominated the Greek mainland for over 3 centuries began their final death throes around 1200 BC. The massive Cyclopean walls of Mycenae, constructed from limestone blocks so enormous that later Greeks believed only the mythical Cyclopes could have moved them, proved insufficient against the forces that would bring down an entire civilization. Archaeological evidence reveals a pattern of systematic destruction across the Mycenaean world that speaks to coordinated attacks rather than isolated incidents of warfare or natural disaster. Pylos, the administrative heart of Messenia, fell victim to a conflagration so intense that it baked the Linear B tablets in the palace archives, inadvertently preserving them for modern archaeologists. The palace complex, with its distinctive megaron featuring a circular hearth surrounded by 4 columns, had served as both royal residence and bureaucratic centre. The destruction layer contains charred wooden beams, melted bronze artefacts, and collapsed masonry that tells the story of a building consumed by flames reaching temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The attackers showed no interest in looting. Valuable bronze vessels and ivory ornaments lay crushed beneath fallen stones, suggesting the destruction aimed at eliminating the palace's administrative function rather than acquiring wealth. The fortress of Tiryns, located in the Argolid Plain, met a similar fate. Its lower citadel, which had housed workshops producing perfumed oils, textiles, and metalwork for export throughout the eastern Mediterranean, shows clear evidence of deliberate demolition. The massive casemate galleries, underground passages within the fortress walls that had served as storage areas and defensive positions, were filled with rubble and debris. The palace's elaborate frescoes, depicting boar hunts and processions of tribute bearers, were systematically defaced before the building's final destruction. Archaeological excavations have revealed that the site's population abandoned the fortress permanently, leaving behind grinding stones, loom weights, and pottery vessels in their workshops and residences. Mycenae itself, the gold-rich citadel celebrated in Homer's epics, experienced destruction on multiple occasions during this period. The palace on the summit of the Acropolis burned completely, its megaron reduced to foundation stones and scattered architectural fragments. The famous Lion Gate, with its relief sculpture of 2 lions flanking a column representing divine protection, remained standing, but the structures beyond it lay in ruins. The shaft graves that had yielded Heinrich Schliemann's spectacular golden death masks and weapons were undisturbed, suggesting the attackers possessed no knowledge of these earlier burial sites or showed no interest in grave robbing. The destruction extended beyond the major palatial centres to secondary sites throughout the Mycenaean world. GLA, the massive fortress in Boeotia that controlled the drainage system of the Kopais Basin, was abandoned after its administrative buildings burned. Iolkos in Thessaly, Crisa near Delphi, and numerous smaller settlements across the Peloponnese show similar patterns of destruction and abandonment. The synchronicity of these events across such a wide geographical area indicates a coordinated campaign rather than isolated local conflicts. The collapse of Linear B administrative systems represented more than the loss of a writing system. It marked the complete breakdown of the complex bureaucratic machinery that had governed Mycenaean society. Linear B tablets from Pylos reveal an intricate administrative structure that recorded everything from livestock inventories to religious offerings, from land tenure arrangements to military mobilization orders. The palace scribes maintained detailed records of bronze allocation to smiths, textile production quotas for palace workshops, and tribute obligations of outlying settlements. These administrative records demonstrate the extent of centralized control exercised by Mycenaean palaces. At Pylos, tablets record the dispatch of coast watchers to specific locations along the western Peloponnese, suggesting organized defensive preparations against seaborne threats. Other documents detail the requisitioning of bronze for weapon production and the mobilization of military units designated by ethnic names, the Cypericians, Messenians, and others who owed military service to the palace. The complexity of this system required not only literate scribes, but also a network of local officials capable of implementing palace directives across extensive territories. The loss of literacy following the palatial destructions was virtually complete. No Linear B inscriptions date the period after 1100 BC, and when alphabetic writing appeared in Greece during the 8th century, it bore no relationship to the earlier syllabic script. The knowledge of Linear B died with the palace scribes, taking with it the accumulated administrative expertise of centuries. This represented a catastrophic loss of institutional memory that affected every aspect of Mycenaean society, from legal procedures to religious rituals, from craft production techniques to diplomatic protocols. The The administrative vacuum left by the collapse of the palatial system had immediate practical consequences. Without central coordination, the extensive irrigation systems that supported agricultural production in areas like the Argolid Plain fell into disrepair. The complex redistribution networks that had moved surplus agricultural products from fertile regions to population centres broke down. Specialised craft production, which had depended on palace-controlled access to raw materials and markets, ceased almost entirely. The archaeological record shows a dramatic decline in the production of luxury goods, fine pottery, and metalwork during the decades following the palatial destructions. The role of the Sea Peoples in destabilising the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks that sustained Mycenaean civilization remains one of the most debated aspects of this period. Egyptian sources, particularly the inscriptions of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, describe devastating attacks by coalitions of maritime raiders identified by names such as the Peliset, Tieka, Shekelesh, Denayan, and Vashesh. These groups, originating from various regions including in Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and possibly Sicily and Sardinia, conducted coordinated campaigns that disrupted established trade routes and destroyed coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples' impact extended far beyond their direct military activities. The destruction of Ugarit, a crucial commercial hub on the Syrian coast, eliminated a key intermediary in the trade networks connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean. Ugarit's archives, preserved in the destruction layer, contain desperate letters requesting military assistance against seaborne attackers. One tablet records the king of Ugarit informing the king of Al-Ashir that enemy ships had burned his cities and committed atrocities against his people. The loss of such commercial centres disrupted the flow of raw materials essential to Mycenaean civilization, including tin for bronze production, ivory for luxury goods, and exotic materials for palace workshops. The collapse of Hittite power in Anatolia, partially attributable to Sea Peoples' activities, eliminated another crucial trading partner for the Mycenaean palaces. Hittite documents from Bogazkoi mention conflicts with Ahiawa, generally identified with Mycenaean Greece, but also record diplomatic exchanges and commercial agreements. The fall of the Hittite Empire around 1180 BC removed a stabilising force in Anatolia and disrupted trade routes that had connected the Aegean with Mesopotamian markets. The resulting political fragmentation of Anatolia created conditions of chronic instability that made long-distance commerce increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. Archaeological evidence from Cyprus provides crucial insights into the Sea Peoples' impact on regional trade networks. The island's copper resources had made it a vital link in Bronze Age commerce, but sites like Enkomi and Kition show destruction levels dating to this period. The disruption of Cypriot copper production had immediate consequences for Mycenaean bronze working, as Cyprus had been a primary source of the metal. The breakdown of these supply chains forced Mycenaean craftsmen to rely on recycled bronze, leading to a decline in both the quantity and quality of metal artefacts. Internal factors within Mycenaean society contributed significantly to the civilizational collapse, creating vulnerabilities that external pressures could exploit. Linear B tablets from Pylos reveal social tensions that may have undermined the stability of the palatial system. Documents record disputes over land tenure, with references to plots held from the damos versus those controlled directly by the palace or religious authorities. These tensions suggest competing claims to agricultural resources that could have weakened social cohesion during periods of external threat. Economic strain appears in multiple forms throughout the archaeological record of the final palatial period. At Pylos, tablets record the collection of bronze from the religious sanctuaries, suggesting desperate attempts to acquire metal for weapon production. The palace workshops show evidence of increased production of utilitarian goods at the expense of luxury items, indicating a shift toward military priorities. Storage areas that had previously contained imported goods increasingly held local products, suggesting difficulties in maintaining long-distance trade relationships. The concentration of population in heavily fortified citadels during the final Mycenaean period indicates widespread insecurity that predated the final destructions. Lower towns associated with major palatial centres were abandoned as populations sought protection within the massive walls of the Acropolis. This defensive concentration placed enormous strain on food supplies and sanitation systems, creating conditions conducive to disease and social unrest. The clustering of population also made communities more vulnerable to coordinated attacks, as the destruction of a single fortified centre could eliminate the administrative and military leadership of an entire region. Climate change during the Late Bronze Age may have exacerbated these internal pressures. Paleoclimatic evidence from the eastern Mediterranean suggests a period of increased aridity beginning around 1200 BC. Pollen analysis from lake sediments in Greece indicates a decline in forest cover and changes in agricultural patterns consistent with the drier conditions. Reduced rainfall would have placed additional stress on agricultural systems already strained by population concentration and military demands. The failure of harvests could have triggered the social upheavals that weakened Mycenaean resistance to external attacks. The interconnected nature of these factors, systematic military destruction, administrative collapse, trade network disruption, and internal social strain, created a cascade of failures that proved impossible to reverse. The Mycenaean civilization that had dominated the Aegean for centuries vanished with startling rapidity, leaving behind only massive stone ruins and the fading memories that would eventually crystallize into the heroic legends of later Greek tradition. The smouldering ruins of Mycenaean civilization created a demographic vacuum that triggered the most significant population movements in Greek prehistory. As the palatial centres lay abandoned and their administrative networks collapsed, entire communities faced the stark choice between adapting to drastically changed circumstances or seeking new territories where they might rebuild their lives. The archaeological record reveals that most chose migration, setting in motion a complex series of population movements that would reshape the ethnic and cultural landscape of the Greek world for centuries to come. The Dorian migration represents the most substantial and consequential of these population movements, fundamentally altering the demographic composition of southern Greece. The Dorians, speaking a distinctive dialect of early Greek characterized by its preservation of long A vowels and specific consonantal features, moved southward from their probable homeland in the mountainous regions of northwestern Greece and southern Illyria. Unlike the gradual infiltration that had characterized earlier population movements, the Dorian expansion occurred with remarkable speed and thoroughness, overwhelming the remnant Mycenaean populations throughout the Peloponnese. Archaeological evidence for the Dorian migration manifests most clearly in dramatic changes to material culture across the affected regions. The distinctive Mycenaean pottery traditions, with their sophisticated painted decorations and standardized forms, disappeared abruptly around 1100 to 1050 BC, replaced by much cruder handmade vessels exhibiting entirely different technological and aesthetic principles. These new ceramic traditions, characterized by simple geometric patterns, coarse fabric, and irregular firing, represent not merely a decline in technical skill, but the introduction of completely different cultural practices by populations unfamiliar with Mycenaean craft traditions. The transformation of burial practices provides equally compelling evidence for population replacement rather than cultural evolution. Mycenaean chamber tombs, elaborate underground structures accessed through long entrance passages called dromoi, fell out of use entirely. The new populations practiced cist grave burial, interring their dead in simple stone-lined rectangular pits, often covered with stone slabs. These graves typically contained minimal grave goods, a few pottery vessels, simple bronze ornaments, and occasionally iron implements, in stark contrast to the elaborate burial assemblages that had characterized Mycenaean elite interments. The distribution pattern of these cultural changes reveals the systematic nature of the Dorian advance. The archaeological record shows that Dorian material culture appeared first in the northern Peloponnese, particularly in the Carinthia and Argolid regions, before spreading southward into Laconia and Messenia. The Dorians established major settlements at sites that would become their principal centres: Sparta in the Eurotas Valley, Argos in the eastern Argolid, and Corinth controlling the strategic isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece. The choice of these locations demonstrates sophisticated strategic thinking, as each site commanded important agricultural resources and communication routes. The impact on existing populations varied considerably across different regions. In some areas, particularly around former Mycenaean centres like Tiryns and Mycenae, the archaeological record suggests violent displacement. Destruction layers containing burned buildings and scattered human remains indicate that some communities experienced direct military conquest. However, in other regions, particularly in more remote mountainous areas, the transition appears to have been more gradual, with evidence suggesting the absorption of existing populations into Dorian social structures rather than their complete elimination. The linguistic evidence supports this pattern of selective displacement and integration. Later, Greek dialects preserve clear traces of pre-Dorian populations, particularly in religious terminology and place names. The survival of non-Greek toponyms throughout the Peloponnese indicates that indigenous populations retained sufficient influence to preserve elements of their cultural heritage despite political subjugation. The Dorians themselves adopted certain local religious practices and maintained cult sites that had been sacred to earlier populations, suggesting a degree of cultural synthesis rather than complete replacement. The Dorian social organisation, as it eventually emerged in historical times, reflects the conditions of their migration period. The three traditional Dorian tribes, the Hilis, Pamphiloi, and Dimenes, likely originated as military divisions during the migration phase, later evolving into the fundamental social units of Dorian communities. This tribal structure provided the organisational framework necessary for coordinating large-scale population movements and establishing new settlements in conquered territories. The emphasis on military valour and collective decision-making that characterised later Dorian societies probably developed during this formative period of conquest and settlement. While the Dorians moved south to occupy the former heartland of Mycenaean civilization, other populations fled eastward across the Aegean Sea to escape the chaos engulfing mainland Greece. The Ionian migration, though less archaeologically visible than the Dorian expansion, represented an equally significant demographic movement that established Greek presence along the western coast of Asia Minor and throughout the central Aegean islands. The Ionians, claiming descent from the pre-Dorian populations of Attica and the northern Peloponnese, carried with them cultural traditions that preserved important elements of Mycenaean heritage. The Ionian migration proceeded in multiple waves over several generations, beginning in the late 12th century BC and continuing into the 10th century. The earliest refugees likely consisted of displaced elites and their followers who possessed sufficient resources to organise overseas expeditions. These initial colonists established footholds on islands like Samos, Chios, and the Cyclades, which served as stepping stones for subsequent expansion to the Anatolian mainland. The strategic importance of these islands lay not only in their defensive potential, but also in their control of sea routes connecting the Aegean with the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence for early Ionian settlement appears most clearly in changes to pottery styles and settlement patterns on the affected islands. The appearance of proto-geometric pottery, characterised by precise compass-drawn circles and semicircles, executed in dark paint-on-light clay, marks the beginning of a new artistic tradition that would eventually evolve into the distinctive geometric style of the 8th century BC. This ceramic tradition, while simpler than Mycenaean pottery, maintained higher technical standards than contemporary Dorian wares, suggesting continuity of craft traditions among the migrating populations. The establishment of Ionian cities along the Asia Minor coast required careful negotiation with existing Anatolian populations and the remnants of Hittite administrative structures. Sites like Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna show evidence of gradual Greek occupation rather than violent conquest, with Greek material culture appearing alongside indigenous Anatolian artefacts in the archaeological record. The process of settlement often involved intermarriage with local populations and the adoption of certain Anatolian religious practices, creating the distinctive cultural synthesis that would characterise Ionian civilization. The Ionian settlements developed unique political institutions adapted to their circumstances as minority populations in foreign territories. The eventual emergence of the Ionian League, a confederation of 12 cities including Miletus, Ephesus, Priene and others, provided collective security and coordinated religious observances centred on the Panionion sanctuary on Mount Mycale. This federal structure enabled the Ionian communities to maintain their Greek identity while adapting to the political realities of Anatolian geography and demographics. The preservation of epic poetry traditions among the Ionian communities played a crucial role in maintaining connections to their mainland Greek heritage. The elaborate oral traditions that would eventually crystallise into the Homeric epics were nurtured in Ionian courts and festivals, preserving memories of the Mycenaean world that had been largely forgotten in mainland Greece. The Ionian dialect preserved in these poems contains archaic features that provide valuable insights into pre-migration Greek linguistic patterns and cultural practices. The third major migration stream involved the Aeolian populations, who established settlements in northern Asia Minor and the island of Lesbos during the 11th and 10th centuries BC. The Aeolians, originating from Thessaly and Boeotia, represented a distinct Greek ethno-linguistic group, whose dialect preserved certain archaic features that distinguished it from both Ionic and Doric Greek. The Aeolian migration followed routes through the northern Aegean, utilising islands like Lemnos and Tenedos as intermediate stations before reaching their final destinations. The archaeological record of Aeolian settlement reveals patterns similar to those of the Ionian migration, but with distinctive regional characteristics. At sites like Antissa and Methymna on Lesbos, excavations have uncovered pottery assemblages that combine Greek proto-geometric elements with local Anatolian traditions, indicating cultural interaction between Greek settlers and indigenous populations. The Aeolian settlements maintained closer connections to mainland Greece than their Ionian counterparts, possibly due to their more northerly location and continued contact with Thessalian communities. The political organisation of Aeolian communities reflected their origins in the aristocratic societies of northern Greece. Unlike the Ionian cities, which developed relatively democratic institutions, Aeolian settlements maintained traditional aristocratic governance structures centred on prominent families who claimed descent from Mycenaean heroes. The poetry of Sappho and Alcaeus, composed in the Aeolian dialects during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, provides insights into the values and social structures of these communities, emphasising personal honour, aristocratic leisure, and the maintenance of traditional cultural practices. The establishment of Aeolian settlements required adaptation to different environmental conditions than those their ancestors had known in mainland Greece. The fertile plains of the Troad and the volcanic soil of Lesbos offered excellent agricultural potential, but the settlers had to learn new cultivation techniques appropriate to Mediterranean climatic conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that Aeolian communities quickly developed successful agricultural economies based on grain production, olive cultivation, and livestock raising, creating the economic foundation for their eventual cultural flowering. The interaction between migrating Greek populations and indigenous Anatolian communities produced complex patterns of cultural exchange that influenced both groups. In some cases, Greek settlers adopted local religious practices and incorporated Anatolian deities into their pantheons. The cult of Cybele, the Anatolian mother goddess, found widespread acceptance among Greek communities in Asia Minor, while traditional Greek deities like Apollo and Artemis acquired new attributes and cult practices influenced by Anatolian traditions. The technological exchange proved equally significant, particularly in metallurgy and pottery production. Anatolian craftsmen possessed advanced ironworking techniques that Greek settlers gradually adopted, accelerating the transition from bronze to iron technology in Greek communities. The distinctive pottery styles that emerged in the Greek settlements of Asia Minor combined Greek decorative traditions with Anatolian vessel forms and firing techniques, creating regional variations that would persist for centuries. The linguistic impact of these population movements extended far beyond the immediate areas of settlement. The establishment of Greek-speaking communities throughout the Aegean created a network of related but distinct dialects that would influence the development of Greek literature and philosophy. The preservation of different dialectical traditions in geographically separated communities provided the linguistic diversity that enriched later Greek cultural expression and intellectual development. The demographic changes resulting from these migrations fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Greek world. The abandonment of many mainland sites reduced the population density in traditional Greek heartlands, while creating new centres of Greek civilization in previously peripheral regions. This redistribution of population contributed to the political fragmentation that characterised the Greek world throughout the Archaic and Classical periods, as no single region possessed sufficient demographic or economic dominance to establish hegemony over the entire Greek-speaking world. The migration period also established patterns of colonial expansion that would characterise later Greek history. The experience of overseas settlement, adaptation to foreign environments, and interaction with non-Greek populations provided precedents and techniques that would prove invaluable during the Great Colonization movement of the 8th and 7th centuries BC. The institutional innovations developed by migrating communities, federal leagues, colonial constitutions, and inter-community religious associations became models for later Greek political experimentation. The archaeological evidence for these population movements continues to expand as new excavations reveal previously unknown settlement sites and cultural sequences. Recent discoveries at sites like Lefkandi in Euboea have revealed unexpected continuities between late Mycenaean and early Iron Age populations, suggesting that the migration period involved more complex patterns of movement and settlement than previously recognised. The ongoing analysis of pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns provides increasingly detailed insights into the mechanisms and chronology of these crucial demographic transformations that shape the emergence of historical Greek civilization. The demographic upheavals that scattered Greek populations across the Aegean dealt a catastrophic blow to the sophisticated commercial networks that had sustained Bronze Age civilization. The destruction of palatial centres eliminated not merely administrative headquarters, but the crucial nodes that had coordinated international trade for over 4 centuries. These palace complexes had functioned as more than royal residences. They served as warehouses, quality control centres, and diplomatic meeting points where merchants from Cyprus, Egypt, the Levant and Mesopotamia conducted business under royal protection and standardised weights and measures. The Linear B archives from Pylos reveal the intricate mechanisms through which Mycenaean palaces had managed long-distance commerce. Tablets record the allocation of bronze ingots to specific craftsmen, the storage of imported ivory and gold in palace treasuries, and the preparation of export goods, including perfumed oils, textiles, and metalwork. Palace officials maintained detailed inventories of exotic materials: elephant ivory from Syria, amber from the Baltic, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and ostrich eggs from Nubia. The destruction of these administrative centres eliminated the institutional knowledge necessary to maintain such complex commercial relationships. The collapse of quality control systems had immediate consequences for Greek participation in international markets. Mycenaean pottery had achieved widespread distribution throughout the eastern Mediterranean, partly because palace workshops maintained consistent standards of production. Archaeological evidence from sites across Cyprus, the Levant and Egypt demonstrates that Mycenaean stirrup jars, used primarily for transporting perfumed oils, met standardised capacity measurements that facilitated international commerce. The destruction of palace workshops eliminated both the technical expertise and administrative oversight necessary to produce goods meeting international market requirements. The disruption of diplomatic relationships proved equally devastating to commercial networks. Bronze Age international trade operated within a framework of diplomatic agreements between royal courts, as evidenced by their Mana letters and other diplomatic archives. Mycenaean rulers had maintained correspondence with pharaohs, Hittite kings, and Levantine princes, establishing the political foundations necessary for secure commercial exchange. The collapse of Mycenaean political authority eliminated Greek participation in this diplomatic network, leaving individual merchants without the royal protection essential for conducting business in foreign territories. Archaeological evidence from trading centres throughout the eastern Mediterranean documents the systematic breakdown of commercial networks during the 12th century BC. At Ugarit, the destruction layers contain Mycenaean pottery dating to the final decades of the 13th century, but no Greek imports appear in context dating after 1180 BC. Similar patterns emerge at sites throughout Cyprus, where Mycenaean pottery disappears from the archaeological record, coinciding with the destruction of major urban centres. The absence of Greek goods in these contexts reflects not merely reduced production, but the complete severance of trade relationships that had persisted for generations. The collapse of Cypriot copper production created immediate shortages of raw materials essential for bronze working throughout the Aegean. Cyprus had supplied the majority of copper consumed by Mycenaean craftsmen, with ingots bearing Cypriot hallmarks appearing in palace storerooms across mainland Greece. The disruption of this supply chain forced Greek metalworkers to rely increasingly on recycled bronze, leading to a dramatic decline in both the quantity and quality of metal artefacts. Archaeological analysis of bronze objects from post-palatial contexts reveals significantly higher concentrations of impurities and inconsistent alloy compositions, indicating the use of scrap metal rather than fresh ingots. The breakdown of tin supply networks proved even more problematic for bronze production. Unlike copper, which could be obtained from multiple sources throughout the eastern Mediterranean, tin deposits were extremely rare and geographically concentrated. The primary sources utilised by Bronze Age civilizations included deposits in Afghanistan, Bohemia, and possibly Britain, requiring elaborate trade networks spanning thousands of kilometres. The disruption of these networks made tin virtually unobtainable for Greek craftsmen, accelerating the transition to iron technology by necessity rather than choice. Egyptian sources provide crucial evidence for the collapse of Aegean trade relationships. The tomb inscriptions of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, dating to the early 12th century BC, list tribute and trade goods received from various foreign peoples, but make no mention of products identifiable as Mycenaean Greek. Earlier Egyptian records, including those from the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, specifically reference goods from Keftiu and Tanaju, indicating established commercial relationships that had been severed by the time of Ramesses III. The transformation of pottery production illustrates the broader collapse of specialised craft industries. Mycenaean pottery workshops had achieved remarkable standardisation through centralised production systems that distributed vessels throughout the Greek world and beyond. The distinctive shapes, decorative schemes, and technical specifications of Mycenaean ceramics reflected sophisticated quality control mechanisms operating under palace supervision. The post-palatial pottery traditions that emerged during the 11th century BC show dramatic regional variation and significantly reduced technical competence, indicating the breakdown of centralised production systems and the loss of specialised knowledge. The decline in metalworking expertise manifested most clearly in weapon production. Mycenaean bronze weapons, particularly the distinctive Type II swords, with their complex construction techniques and elaborate decorative inlays, required sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and access to high-quality raw materials. The weapons produced during the post-palatial period show simplified construction methods, reduced size, and inferior metal quality. Archaeological analysis reveals that many post-palatial bronze implements were manufactured from recycled material, often incorporating fragments of earlier weapons and tools melted down and recast into simpler forms. The disappearance of luxury crafts reflected both the loss of technical knowledge and the absence of markets capable of supporting specialised artisans. Mycenaean palace workshops had produced elaborate ivory carvings, gold jewellery, and decorated weapons that served as diplomatic gifts and trade goods. The production of such items required not only skilled craftsmen, but also access to exotic raw materials and wealthy patrons willing to commission expensive works. The collapse of palatial society eliminated both the economic foundation and cultural context necessary to support luxury craft production. The transition from bronze to iron technology occurred gradually and unevenly across the Greek world, driven more by necessity than technological advancement. Ironworking had been known in the Aegean since at least the 14th century BC, but bronze remained the preferred material for tools and weapons due to its superior working properties and the established supply chains for copper and tin. The disruption of bronze supply networks forced craftsmen to experiment with iron technology, leading to gradual improvements in smelting and forging techniques. The earliest iron implements found in Greek contexts date to the late 12th century BC and show relatively crude manufacturing techniques. These early iron tools were often inferior to their bronze predecessors in terms of hardness and edge retention, but iron ore was locally available in many regions of Greece, eliminating dependence on long-distance trade networks. The gradual improvement in ironworking techniques during the 11th and 10th centuries BC reflected accumulated experience rather than sudden technological breakthroughs. Iron technology had profound implications for agricultural production and social organisation. Iron ploughshares and agricultural tools proved more effective than bronze implements for clearing forested land and cultivating heavy soils. The increased availability of iron tools enabled communities to expand agricultural production into previously marginal areas, supporting population growth despite the collapse of trade networks. The democratization of metal tools, iron being more abundant than bronze, may have contributed to social changes that reduced the power of traditional elites who had controlled access to bronze weapons and tools. The military implications of iron technology were equally significant. Iron weapons, while initially inferior to bronze, offered advantages in terms of availability and repairability. A community with access to iron ore deposits could equip larger numbers of warriors than one dependent on imported bronze. The gradual improvement in ironworking techniques eventually produced weapons superior to bronze in terms of hardness and edge retention. Archaeological evidence suggests that iron weapons became standard military equipment throughout most of Greece by the 10th century BC. The shift to iron technology also affected domestic life and daily activities. Iron knives, needles, and household tools became increasingly common during the Dark Age period, replacing bronze implements that had become scarce and expensive. The durability and sharpness of iron tools improved food preparation, textile production, and woodworking, contributing to gradual improvements in living standards, despite the overall decline in material wealth. The archaeological record shows increasing numbers of iron fibulae and personal ornaments, indicating that ironworking had become sufficiently sophisticated to produce decorative as well as utilitarian objects. The breakdown of specialised craft production forced communities to develop more self-sufficient economic systems. The elaborate division of labour that had characterised Mycenaean society, with specialised workshops producing goods for redistribution throughout palace territories, gave way to household-based production systems where individual families manufactured most of their own necessities. Archaeological evidence from Dark Age settlements reveals that pottery, textiles and metal tools were produced at the household level rather than in centralised workshops. This economic reorganisation had profound social implications. The palace controlled redistribution systems that supported specialised craftsmen, religious personnel, and administrative officials disappeared, forcing these populations to engage in agricultural production or emigrate to regions where their skills remained valued. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record hundreds of individuals engaged in specialised occupations: bronze smiths, perfume makers, textile workers, chariot builders, and palace officials, whose livelihoods depended on the palatial economic system. The collapse of this system eliminated these occupational categories from Greek society for several centuries. The archaeological evidence for reduced material wealth appears consistently across Dark Age settlement sites. The elaborate grave goods that had characterised Mycenaean elite burials, gold jewellery, bronze weapons, imported ivory objects, and fine pottery virtually disappear from the archaeological record. Dark Age burials typically contain only simple pottery vessels, basic iron implements, and occasional bronze ornaments of local manufacture. The contrast between Mycenaean shaft grave assemblages, with their spectacular golden death masks and elaborate weaponry, and Dark Age cis graves, containing a few handmade pots and simple iron pins, illustrates the dramatic decline in accumulated wealth. Settlement patterns also reflect the economic constraints of the Dark Age period. The massive fortification walls that had protected Mycenaean centres required enormous investments of labour and resources that post-palatial communities could not afford. Dark Age settlements typically consisted of small clusters of simple houses constructed from readily available local materials, stone foundations supporting walls of mud, brick or wood. The elaborate architectural features that had characterised Mycenaean palaces, ashlar masonry, painted plaster, and complex drainage systems disappeared from the archaeological record. The size of Dark Age communities reflects the constraints imposed by subsistence-level economies. Most settlements contained fewer than 50 houses, suggesting populations of 200 to 300 individuals. These small communities could be supported by the agricultural production of their immediate territories without requiring complex redistribution systems or long-distance trade relationships. The archaeological evidence suggests that most Dark Age communities practiced mixed farming, combining cereal cultivation with animal husbandry and supplementing their diet through hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. The persistence of certain craft traditions, despite overall economic decline, demonstrates the selective preservation of essential technologies. Pottery production, while simplified in terms of decorative schemes and vessel forms, maintained adequate technical standards for storage and cooking vessels. Textile production continued at the household level, with archaeological evidence for spindle whorls and loom weights appearing consistently in Dark Age contexts. Metalworking survived in simplified forms, focusing on essential tools and weapons rather than luxury objects. The gradual recovery of local exchange networks during the later Dark Age period laid the foundations for eventual reintegration into Mediterranean commerce. Archaeological evidence from 10th and 9th century BC contexts shows increasing standardization of pottery forms and decorative motifs across wider geographical areas, suggesting the re-establishment of regional trade relationships. The appearance of exotic materials, amber from northern Europe, ivory from the Near East, in 9th century contexts indicates that some communities had begun to re-establish long-distance commercial contacts. The economic isolation that characterized the Dark Age period coincided with one of the most profound cultural transformations in Greek history: the complete disappearance of literacy and the emergence of sophisticated oral traditions that would preserve essential cultural knowledge for over 4 centuries. The Linear B script, which had served as the administrative backbone of Mycenaean civilization, vanished so thoroughly that when alphabetic writing eventually reached Greece around 750 BC, it arrived as a completely foreign innovation with no connection to the earlier syllabic system. The final Linear B tablets from Pylos, baked in the conflagration that destroyed the palace around 1180 BC, represent the last documented use of this script anywhere in the Greek world. These tablets, dealing with routine administrative matters such as livestock inventories and personnel assignments, show no awareness of impending catastrophe. The scribes who produced them possessed sophisticated literacy skills, capable of recording complex legal documents, religious regulations, and diplomatic correspondence in a script that required mastery of over 80 syllabic signs, plus numerous ideograms representing commodities, livestock, and measurements. The disappearance of Linear B literacy was not gradual, but catastrophic. Unlike other ancient writing systems that evolved or were gradually replaced by more efficient scripts, Linear B simply ceased to exist. No transitional documents survive. No simplified versions appear in post-glacial contexts, and no evidence suggests that knowledge of the script persisted in any form after the palace destructions. The archaeological record reveals a complete break between the literate Mycenaean world and the non-literate societies that succeeded it. The institutional context that had supported Linear B literacy explains its sudden disappearance. The script served exclusively administrative functions within the palace bureaucracies, recorded on clay tablets that were typically recycled after their immediate purpose was fulfilled. Only the accidental firing of tablet archives during palace destructions preserved these documents for modern discovery. The scribes who maintained this system represented a small, highly specialised professional class whose training and employment depended entirely on the palatial administrative apparatus. Linear B scribes underwent extensive training to master the complex syllabic system and the specialised vocabulary required for administrative documentation. The tablets reveal standardised terminology for legal concepts, religious practices, and bureaucratic procedures that required years of study to master. The scribes also needed familiarity with the various regional dialects represented in palace territories, as administrative documents record personal names and place names from throughout the Mycenaean world. This specialised knowledge died with the palace scribes, leaving no mechanism for transmission to subsequent generations. The absence of any monumental inscriptions in Linear B indicates that literacy remained confined to administrative contexts. Unlike contemporary civilizations such as Egypt or Mesopotamia, where writing appeared on temple walls, royal monuments, and private dedicatory objects, Mycenaean Greece produced no public inscriptions that might have preserved knowledge of the script beyond palace circles. The purely utilitarian nature of Linear B literacy made it completely dependent on the institutional structures that supported it. The 4-century gap between the disappearance of Linear B and the adoption of alphabetic writing represents the longest period of illiteracy in Greek history. During this extended interval, Greek communities developed alternative methods for preserving and transmitting essential cultural information. The oral traditions that emerged during this period proved remarkably effective at maintaining cultural continuity, despite the absence of written records. The adoption of the Phoenician alphabet around 750 BC occurred through commercial contacts with Levantine traders, rather than any indigenous development of writing systems. The earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions appear on pottery vessels from trading centres such as Pithekizai and Cumae in southern Italy, where Greek colonists encountered Phoenician merchants. The Greek adaptation of the Phoenician script involves significant modifications, particularly the systematic use of certain consonantal signs to represent vowel sounds, creating the first true alphabet in human history. The process of alphabetic adoption reveals the complete break with earlier writing traditions. Greek scribes who learned the Phoenician script showed no knowledge of Linear B conventions or terminology. The vocabulary and formulaic expressions that appear in early alphabetic inscriptions derive from contemporary spoken Greek rather than administrative traditions preserved from the Bronze Age. The absence of any Linear B influence in early alphabetic writing confirms that knowledge of the earlier script had been completely lost. The 4 centuries of illiteracy forced Greek communities to develop sophisticated oral traditions for preserving essential cultural knowledge. These traditions encompass not only entertainment and artistic expression, but also legal procedures, religious practices, genealogical records, and historical memories. The effectiveness of these oral preservation systems is demonstrated by the remarkable consistency of mythological narratives and religious practices across the widely scattered Greek communities of the Dark Age period. The epic poetry tradition that eventually produced the Homeric poems represents the most sophisticated achievement of Dark Age oral culture. These poems preserve detailed memories of Bronze Age civilization, including accurate descriptions of material culture, social institutions, and geographical knowledge that could only have been transmitted through carefully maintained oral traditions. The archaeological confirmation of numerous details mentioned in the Homeric epics, from the boar's tusk helmet described in the Iliad to the complex geography of Bronze Age Troy, demonstrates the remarkable accuracy of oral transmission over many centuries. The Homeric tradition preserved Bronze Age memories through a complex system of formulaic composition that enabled bards to maintain narrative consistency while adapting their performances to different audiences and occasions. The repeated epithets, standardized scenes, and metrical formulas that characterize Homeric poetry served not merely as artistic devices but as mnemonic aids that ensured accurate transmission of traditional material. The wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, and swift-footed Achilles represented fixed elements in a flexible system that allowed for both preservation and innovation. Archaeological evidence confirms that many details preserved in Homeric poetry accurately reflect Bronze Age realities rather than Dark Age conditions. The description of Nestor's cup in the Iliad corresponds remarkably to actual Mycenaean vessels discovered by archaeologists, while the catalogue of ships in the same poem preserves Bronze Age political geography that had been completely transformed by the time of alphabetic writing. The preservation of such specific details through 4 centuries of oral transmission demonstrates the effectiveness of bardic memory systems. The bards who maintained these epic traditions, known as Aoi Doi, occupied crucial positions within Dark Age communities. These professional singers served not merely as entertainers, but as repositories of cultural memory, genealogical knowledge, and religious tradition. The Oidoi preserved the stories that defined community identity, maintained the genealogies that legitimized aristocratic claims to leadership, and transmitted the religious knowledge necessary for proper ritual observance. The training of our Oidoi required years of intensive study and practice. Aspiring bards memorized vast repertoires of traditional stories, learned the complex metrical and formulaic systems that governed epic composition, and developed the performance skills necessary to hold audiences for hours at a time. The Homeric Hymn to Apollo provides insights into bardic training, describing how young singers learned their craft through apprenticeship to established masters who passed down traditional material through direct instruction and supervised practice. The social status of Oidoi varied considerably across different communities, but their cultural importance remained consistently high. In aristocratic households, skilled bards enjoyed positions of honour and received substantial material rewards for their performances. The Odyssey depicts the bard Demodocus receiving gifts of meat, wine, and precious objects from his aristocratic patrons, while Phemius in Ithaca holds a position of sufficient importance that the suitors compete for his services during Odysseus's absence. The repertoire of Dark Age bards extended far beyond the heroic narratives that eventually became the Homeric epics. These singers also maintained genealogical traditions that trace the ancestry of prominent families back to mythological heroes and gods. Such genealogies served crucial political functions, legitimizing claims to leadership and establishing relationships between communities scattered across the Greek world. The preservation of genealogical knowledge required extraordinary precision, as errors could invalidate claims to status and inheritance. Legal traditions also depended on bardic preservation during the illiterate period. In the absence of written law codes, communities relied on the memorized knowledge of legal specialists who maintained traditions regarding proper procedures, precedent cases, and customary penalties. These legal traditions often took poetic form to aid memorization, with rhythmic verses preserving complex regulations governing property rights, inheritance procedures, and criminal penalties. Religious knowledge represented another crucial domain preserved through oral tradition. The proper performance of rituals, the genealogies of gods, and the traditional stories explaining divine relationships required precise transmission to maintain their efficacy. Religious specialists, often overlapping with the bardic class, preserved hymns, prayers, and ritual procedures that ensured community access to divine favour. The Homeric hymns, composed during the later Dark Age period, demonstrate the sophistication of religious poetry traditions that preserve theological knowledge in memorable verse forms. The preservation of geographical knowledge through oral tradition enabled Greek communities to maintain connections across the scattered settlements of the post-migration period. Bardic traditions preserved detailed knowledge of sea routes, coastal landmarks, and the locations of distant communities that proved essential for trade, diplomatic contact, and colonial expansion. The accuracy of geographical information preserved in epic poetry is demonstrated by archaeological confirmation of sites mentioned in the Homeric poems, from the location of Troy to the identification of Ithaca. The mythological narratives that flourished during the Dark Age period served multiple functions beyond entertainment and cultural preservation. These stories encoded historical memories of the Bronze Age collapse, transforming the traumatic experiences of civilizational destruction into comprehensible narratives that explained contemporary conditions while maintaining hope for future recovery. The Trojan War cycle, with its themes of heroic struggle, divine intervention, and ultimate victory, provided a framework for understanding the catastrophes that had befallen Greek civilization. The transformation of historical memories into mythological narratives involved complex processes of selection, interpretation, and symbolic encoding. The destruction of Mycenaean centres became the siege of Troy, the migration period became the wanderings of heroes returning from war, and the struggle to establish new communities became the foundation myths of various Greek cities. These transformations preserved essential historical information while making it emotionally accessible and culturally meaningful for Dark Age audiences. The role of women in oral tradition preservation deserves particular attention, as female singers and storytellers maintained important cultural traditions alongside their male counterparts. Archaeological evidence suggests that women participated actively in religious ceremonies that involved ritual singing and storytelling. The preservation of domestic traditions, including craft techniques, agricultural knowledge, and household religious practices, often fell to women who transmitted this information through work songs, lullabies, and informal storytelling. The geographical distribution of oral traditions reveals the extent of cultural connections maintained during the Dark Age period. Mythological narratives, heroic genealogies, and religious practices show remarkable consistency across Greek communities separated by hundreds of kilometres of land and sea. The Ionian settlements of Asia Minor preserved epic traditions that corresponded closely to those maintained in mainland Greece, despite centuries of separation and different environmental conditions. The preservation of dialectical variations within oral traditions provides evidence for the complex linguistic landscape of Dark Age Greece. The Homeric poems preserve archaic linguistic features from multiple Greek dialects, suggesting that bardic traditions maintained awareness of regional linguistic differences while creating a standardized poetic language that could be understood across dialectical boundaries. This artificial poetic language enabled cultural communication between communities whose everyday speech had diverged significantly during the migration period. The interaction between oral traditions and emerging literacy during the 8th century BC created unique opportunities for cultural preservation and innovation. The first alphabetic transcriptions of epic poetry captured oral traditions at a crucial moment when bardic memory systems remained intact while writing. Technology offered new possibilities for preservation and dissemination. The Homeric poems represent this intersection of oral and literate culture, preserving ancient traditions in a new medium that would ensure their survival for subsequent millennia. The accuracy of oral transmission during the Dark Age period challenges modern assumptions about the reliability of non-literate cultural preservation. The archaeological confirmation of Bronze Age details preserved in epic poetry demonstrates that oral traditions could maintain historical accuracy over many centuries when supported by appropriate social institutions and training systems. The bardic schools of Dark Age Greece developed memory techniques and performance practices that rivaled written records in their precision and reliability. The transition from oral to literate culture involved significant changes in how cultural knowledge was organised and transmitted. Written texts fixed narrative versions that had previously remained flexible, standardising stories that oral tradition had allowed to vary according to audience and occasion. The alphabetic recording of epic poetry marked the beginning of canonical literary traditions that would influence Greek cultural development for centuries to come, while simultaneously ending the dynamic oral culture that had preserved Greek civilization through its darkest period. The collapse of Mycenaean palatial civilization fundamentally altered the religious landscape of Greece, transforming elaborate state-sponsored cult practices into decentralized community-based worship systems that would eventually evolve into the polis religious institutions of the Archaic period. The Linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos reveal a complex religious hierarchy centered on palace-controlled sanctuaries where professional priests and priestesses conducted elaborate rituals using precious vessels, exotic offerings, and carefully maintained inventories of sacred objects. These palatial religious systems disappeared along with the administrative apparatus that supported them, forcing Greek communities to develop new forms of religious organisation adapted to their reduced circumstances and scattered settlements. The Mycenaean religious system had operated through a sophisticated network of major and minor sanctuaries distributed throughout palace territories. The palace at Pylos controlled at least 16 named sanctuaries, each with its own complement of religious personnel and specific ritual responsibilities. The tablets record offerings of livestock, precious metals, textiles, and perfumed oils to various deities, with palace officials coordinating these contributions according to complex ceremonial calendars. The destruction of palace archives eliminated not only the administrative records, but also the specialised knowledge necessary to maintain these elaborate ritual systems. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean sanctuary sites reveals the material wealth that had supported Bronze Age religious practices. Excavations at the sanctuary of Poseidon at Isthmia have uncovered elaborate bronze vessels, ivory figurines, and gold jewellery dating to the late Helladic 33B period, demonstrating the resources that palace administrations devoted to religious observances. The sudden absence of such luxury goods from post-palatial religious contexts reflects not merely economic decline, but the fundamental transformation of religious institutions from state-sponsored enterprises to community-based activities dependent on local resources. The transition from palatial to community-based religion occurred gradually and unevenly across different regions of Greece. In some areas, particularly those that experienced violent destruction, religious continuity was completely severed. The sanctuary of Hera at Argos shows a clear break in the archaeological record around 1200 BC, with no evidence of ritual activity resuming until the 10th century. In contrast, certain rural sanctuaries that had operated independently of palace control continued functioning throughout the transitional period, though with significantly reduced material offerings and simplified ritual practices. The survival of specific deities from the Bronze Age into the historical period demonstrates remarkable continuity despite institutional disruption. Poseidon, whose name appears frequently in Linear B tablets as Poseideon, maintained his position as a major Greek deity throughout the Dark Age period. The god's association with horses, earthquakes, and the sea persisted from Mycenaean times into classical Greek religion, though his cult practices evolved considerably. The Mycenaean tablets record elaborate horse sacrifices to Poseidon, involving teams of animals and precious equipment that Dark Age communities could not afford to replicate. Athena represents another clear example of Bronze Age religious continuity. The Linear B tablets from Knossos mention a goddess called Atana Potinija, who received offerings at multiple sanctuaries throughout Crete. The goddess's association with crafts, warfare, and civic protection carried forward into the historical period, though her cult practices adapted to new social and political circumstances. The elaborate textile offerings recorded in Mycenaean archives gave way to simpler dedications, appropriate to the reduced economic circumstances of Dark Age communities. The persistence of Zeus worship throughout the transitional period reflects the fundamental importance of sky gods in Indo-European religious traditions. Linear B tablets record offerings to Zeus at various locations, and archaeological evidence suggests that hilltop sanctuaries dedicated to Zeus continued functioning throughout the Dark Age. The sanctuary of Zeus on Mount Lycaon in Arcadia shows continuous ritual activity from the Late Bronze Age through the Archaic period, though the nature of offerings and ritual practices changed significantly over time. The transformation of religious practices involved not only the adaptation of Bronze Age deities, but also the introduction of new divine figures and cult practices that reflected changed social conditions. The emergence of hero cults during the Dark Age period represents one of the most significant religious innovations of this era. These cults focused on the veneration of deceased individuals, often identified with legendary figures from the heroic past, and typically centered on specific burial sites that became focal points for community ritual activity. The development of hero cults coincided with the discovery and reuse of Bronze Age burial sites by Dark Age communities. Mycenaean tholos tombs and chamber tombs, abandoned for centuries, attracted the attention of later populations, who interpreted these impressive structures as the burial places of legendary heroes. The tomb identified as that of Agamemnon at Mycenae became a focus of hero cult activity during the 8th century BC, with archaeological evidence revealing offerings of pottery, weapons, and food deposited by worshippers who believed they were honouring the legendary king. The hero cult at Menide in Attica provides detailed archaeological evidence for the development of these new religious practices. A Mycenaean chamber tomb, originally constructed during the 14th century BC, began receiving renewed attention around 750 BC when local communities started depositing offerings in and around the burial chamber. These offerings included geometric pottery, bronze fibulae, and iron weapons that demonstrate the transformation of an ancient burial site into an active religious centre. The cult continued for several centuries, with successive generations adding their own offerings to honour the anonymous hero believed to rest within the tomb. The hero cult at Lefkandi reveals the complex relationship between Bronze Age memories and Dark Age religious innovation. A massive building constructed during the 10th century BC directly over earlier Bronze Age remains contained elaborate burials accompanied by rich grave goods, including gold jewellery, bronze vessels, and sacrificed horses. The building was deliberately destroyed and covered with a burial mound, creating a heroon that became the focus of continuing ritual activity. The scale and wealth of this installation demonstrate that some Dark Age communities possessed sufficient resources to create impressive religious monuments despite overall economic decline. The connection between hero cults and Mycenaean tomb sites extended beyond mere physical proximity to encompass complex processes of cultural interpretation and religious innovation. Dark Age Greeks, encountering impressive Bronze Age architectural remains, developed elaborate mythological explanations for these structures, often identifying them with heroes mentioned in epic poetry. The massive walls of Mycenaean citadels became the work of Cyclopes, while elaborate tombs housed the remains of legendary kings and warriors whose deeds were celebrated in bardic traditions. The archaeological evidence reveals that hero cult practices varied considerably across different regions and communities. Some cults focused on specific burial sites and involved regular offerings of food, drink, and valuable objects. Others centered on natural features such as springs, caves, or unusual rock formations that were associated with legendary figures. The diversity of hero cult practices reflects the decentralized nature of Dark Age religious development, with individual communities creating their own interpretations of heroic traditions and appropriate ritual responses. The emergence of hero cults had profound implications for the development of Greek religious thought and practice. These cults established the concept that deceased individuals could continue to influence the living world through supernatural intervention, creating a religious framework that would eventually encompass the worship of historical figures alongside legendary heroes. The practice of seeking divine favour through offerings at heroic burial sites also established precedents for the elaborate tomb cults that would characterise later Greek religious practice. The transformation of burial practices during the Dark Age period reflects broader changes in religious attitudes and social organisation. Mycenaean elite burials had involved elaborate chamber tombs or tholos structures that served multiple generations of the same family. These communal burial sites reinforced aristocratic lineage claims and demonstrated the wealth and power of prominent families through their impressive architecture and rich grave goods. The destruction of Mycenaean social hierarchies eliminated both the resources and social context necessary to maintain such elaborate burial traditions. The adoption of individual inhumation practices during the 11th and 10th centuries BC marked a fundamental shift in burial customs that reflected changed social conditions and religious beliefs. Instead of the communal chamber tombs that had characterised Mycenaean practice, Dark Age communities began burying their dead in simple cist graves constructed from stone slabs and designed to accommodate single individuals. These graves typically contained minimal grave goods, a few pottery vessels, simple bronze or iron ornaments, and occasionally weapons or tools, reflecting both reduced economic circumstances and different concepts of appropriate burial treatment. The practice of cremation, which became increasingly common during the later Dark Age period, represented another significant departure from Bronze Age burial traditions. Cremation required different ritual procedures, different types of grave goods, and different concepts of the relationship between the deceased and the living. The adoption of cremation practices may have been influenced by contact with other Mediterranean cultures, or may have developed independently as Greek communities experimented with new approaches to death and burial. The emergence of geometric pottery during the 10th and 9th centuries BC coincided with these changes in burial practices and religious attitudes. Geometric pottery, characterized by precisely executed linear designs, compass-drawn circles, and increasingly complex decorative schemes, represented a dramatic departure from both Mycenaean ceramic traditions and the crude handmade pottery of the early Dark Age period. The geometric style reflected new aesthetic sensibilities and technical capabilities that developed as Greek communities gradually recovered from the disruptions of the Bronze Age collapse. The relationship between geometric pottery and religious practice appears most clearly in the elaborate vessels created specifically for burial use. Large geometric amphoras and craters, often standing over a metre in height, served as grave markers and containers for cremated remains. These vessels featured increasingly sophisticated decorative programs that included human and animal figures arranged in complex narrative scenes. The famous Dipylon amphora from Athens, dating to around 750 BC, depicts elaborate funeral processions with mourners, chariots, and warriors arranged in registers that demonstrate both artistic sophistication and complex religious symbolism. The geometric pottery style spread throughout the Greek world during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, suggesting the re-establishment of cultural connections between communities that had been isolated during the early Dark Age period. The consistency of geometric decorative motifs across widely separated regions indicates renewed contact and cultural exchange that facilitated the transmission of artistic techniques and religious practices. The geometric style also influenced other art forms, including metalwork, ivory carving, and textile production, creating a unified aesthetic that reflected shared cultural values. The religious significance of geometric art extended beyond its use in burial contexts to encompass broader concepts of order, harmony, and divine proportion. The precise mathematical relationships that governed geometric decorative schemes reflected religious beliefs about cosmic order and divine influence in human affairs. The careful execution of geometric patterns required technical skill and artistic discipline that demonstrated respect for traditional standards and divine expectations. The geometric style thus served both aesthetic and religious functions, creating objects that were both beautiful and spiritually meaningful. The development of sanctuary sites during the later Dark Age period reveals the gradual re-establishment of organised religious activities that would eventually evolve into the elaborate temple complexes of the Archaic period. Early Dark Age sanctuaries typically consisted of simple outdoor altars surrounded by areas for depositing votive offerings, without the elaborate architectural structures that had characterised Mycenaean religious sites. These humble beginnings reflected both limited economic resources and different concepts of appropriate divine accommodation. The Sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi provides crucial evidence for the evolution of Dark Age religious institutions. Archaeological evidence suggests that ritual activity at the site continued throughout the Dark Age period, though on a much reduced scale compared to later developments. Early offerings consisted primarily of simple bronze and iron objects, geometric pottery, and small figurines that demonstrate continuing belief in the site's sacred character despite the absence of elaborate temple structures. The gradual increase in offering quantities and quality during the 9th and 8th centuries reflects the growing prosperity and organisational capacity of the communities that supported the sanctuary. The religious practices that developed during the Dark Age period established fundamental patterns that would characterise Greek religion throughout the historical period. The emphasis on community-based cult activities, the importance of hero worship, and the integration of religious practices with civic identity all originated during the centuries of political fragmentation and economic hardship that followed the Bronze Age collapse. The religious innovations of the Dark Age period thus represent not merely adaptations to reduced circumstances, but creative responses to changed conditions that produced new forms of spiritual expression and community organisation. The archaeological evidence for religious continuity and transformation during the Dark Age period continues to expand as excavations reveal previously unknown sanctuary sites and burial grounds. Recent discoveries have provided new insights into the regional variations in religious practice and the complex processes through which Bronze Age traditions were adapted to meet the needs of Dark Age communities. The ongoing analysis of votive offerings, burial assemblages, and sanctuary architecture contributes to our understanding of how Greek religious traditions evolved during this crucial formative period that established the foundations for the remarkable cultural achievements of the Archaic and Classical periods. The religious transformations of the Dark Age period unfolded alongside equally dramatic changes in how Greek communities organised their physical spaces and structured their political relationships. The massive Mycenaean citadels that had dominated the landscape for centuries lay abandoned, their Cyclopean walls serving as stark reminders of vanished power while new forms of settlement emerged to meet the needs of fragmented populations. The shift from palatial centres to smaller defensible communities represented more than mere demographic adjustment. It constituted a fundamental reimagining of how human societies could organise themselves in the absence of centralised authority. The abandonment of major Mycenaean centres occurred with startling completeness across the Greek mainland. Mycenae itself, despite its legendary status and impressive fortifications, supported only a tiny population during the 11th and 10th centuries BC. Archaeological surveys reveal scattered pottery sherds and simple structures within the massive walls, but nothing approaching the dense occupation that had characterised the Palatial period. The great megaron that had served as the throne room of Agamemnon's historical predecessors stood roofless and empty, its painted floors gradually buried under accumulating debris and windblown soil. Tiryns experienced similar abandonment despite its strategic location in the fertile Argolid plain. The elaborate palace complex with its distinctive corbelled galleries remained structurally intact but functionally obsolete. Post-palatial occupation concentrated in the lower citadel, where simple houses built from reused ashlar blocks provided shelter for a drastically reduced population. These inhabitants showed no understanding of the sophisticated hydraulic systems that had supplied water to the Bronze Age fortress, instead relying on simple wells and cisterns that met their modest needs without requiring complex engineering knowledge. The fortress of GLA in Boeotia, which had controlled the drainage of the Kopais Basin through an elaborate system of dikes and canals, became completely uninhabitable once its hydraulic infrastructure collapsed. The massive enclosure walls, encompassing an area larger than Tiryns and Mycenae combined, enclosed only empty fields and ruined buildings during the Dark Age period. The sophisticated water management systems that had made intensive agriculture possible in the basin fell into disrepair, transforming productive farmland into seasonal marshes that could support only limited settlement. Pylos presents perhaps the most dramatic example of complete abandonment. The palace that had administered the extensive kingdom of Messenia through its sophisticated Linear B bureaucracy never saw reoccupation after its destruction around 1180 BC. The site remained deserted throughout the Dark Age period, with no evidence of even temporary shelter within the ruins. The abandonment was so complete that later Greek traditions preserved no memory of the site's former importance, and the location of Nestor's palace remained unknown until modern archaeological investigation. The pattern of abandonment extended beyond the major palatial centres to encompass the entire network of secondary sites that had comprised Mycenaean administrative systems. The fortress of Medea in the Argolid, which had controlled access routes between the coastal plain and the interior mountains, shows no evidence of post-palatial occupation. Similarly, the administrative centre at Nicoria in Messenia, which Linear B tablets reveal had managed extensive agricultural territories for the palace at Pylos, was completely abandoned after the Bronze Age collapse. The reasons for such thorough abandonment involved multiple interconnected factors beyond mere military destruction. The massive fortification systems of Mycenaean centres required constant maintenance that post-palatial communities could not afford. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae incorporated drainage systems, postern gates, and defensive features that demanded specialised engineering knowledge to maintain effectively. Without palace-sponsored maintenance crews, these sophisticated fortifications quickly became liabilities rather than assets, their crumbling walls creating hazardous conditions rather than providing security. The water supply systems of major Mycenaean centres presented similar maintenance challenges. Mycenae's underground cistern, accessed through a complex system of tunnels and chambers cut into bedrock, required regular cleaning and repair to function properly. The elaborate fountain houses and drainage systems of Tiryns demanded constant attention to prevent blockages and structural failures. Post-palatial communities lacked both the technical expertise and organisational capacity necessary to maintain these sophisticated hydraulic installations. The defensive advantages that had originally justified the locations of Mycenaean citadels became irrelevant in the changed circumstances of the Dark Age period. The hilltop positions that provided commanding views of surrounding territories and defensive advantages against Bronze Age siege techniques offered little benefit to small communities primarily concerned with agricultural subsistence. The steep slopes and rocky terrain that enhanced military defensibility hindered agricultural activities and made daily life unnecessarily difficult for populations no longer facing coordinated military threats. The shift to smaller, more defensible settlements reflected both practical considerations and changed social structures. Dark Age communities typically established themselves on low hills or elevated plateaus that provided defensive advantages while remaining accessible for agricultural activities. These locations offered protection against raiders and wild animals without requiring the massive fortification investments that had characterized Mycenaean centers. The settlements could be defended by their entire adult male population without needing professional military specialists or elaborate siege equipment. Archaeological evidence from sites like Nicoria in Messenia reveals the characteristics of these new settlement types. The Dark Age community that developed at Nicoria during the 10th century BC consisted of scattered houses distributed across a low ridge overlooking agricultural land. The settlement lacked fortification walls, instead relying on its elevated position and the defensive capabilities of individual households for security. The houses themselves were simple rectangular structures built from local stone and timber, designed for functionality rather than display. The internal organisation of Dark Age settlements reflected egalitarian social structures that contrasted sharply with the hierarchical arrangements of Mycenaean centres. Instead of the palace-centred layouts that had characterised Bronze Age sites, Dark Age communities typically organised themselves around common areas used for assemblies, markets, and religious activities. These proto-agora spaces served multiple functions, providing venues for political decision-making, economic exchange, and community celebrations that reinforced social cohesion. The settlement at Lefkandi on Euboea provides exceptional evidence for the evolution of Dark Age community organisation. The site developed around a massive 10th century building that served both residential and ceremonial functions. This structure, measuring over 40 metres in length, contained elaborate burials accompanied by rich grave goods, including gold jewellery, bronze vessels, and sacrificed horses. The building's destruction and conversion into a Heroan created a focal point for community identity that influenced subsequent settlement development. The Lefkandi Heroan demonstrates how Dark Age communities created new forms of monumental architecture, adapted to their social and economic circumstances. Unlike Mycenaean palaces, which served as administrative centres and royal residences, the Lefkandi building functioned primarily as a community focal point that reinforced collective identity through heroic commemoration. The structure's impressive size and construction quality required coordinated community effort, but avoided the elaborate decorative programmes that had characterised palatial architecture. The gradual process of Sinoicism through which scattered Dark Age settlements coalesced into larger political units represents one of the most significant developments of the later Dark Age period. This process typically began with loose confederations of neighbouring communities that cooperated for mutual defence and shared religious observances. Over time, these cooperative arrangements evolved into more formal political relationships that eventually produced the unified polis communities of the Archaic period. The Sinoicism of Attica provides the best documented example of this gradual political consolidation. Archaeological evidence reveals numerous small settlements scattered throughout the Attic countryside during the early Dark Age period, each controlling limited territories and maintaining independent political identities. The communities at Marathon, Brauron, Eleusis, and other locations developed their own religious centres, burial grounds, and defensive arrangements without acknowledging any central authority. The process of Attic Sinoicism occurred gradually over several centuries, beginning with the establishment of religious connections between scattered communities. The cult of Athena Polias on the Athenian Acropolis began attracting worshippers from throughout Attica during the 10th century BC, creating a religious focus that transcended local community boundaries. The annual Panathenaic festival, which celebrated Athena's protection of all Attic communities, provided a forum for intercommunity contact and cooperation. Economic factors contributed significantly to the Sinoicism process, as communities recognised the advantages of coordinated resource management and trade relationships. The control of silver deposits at Lorien required cooperation between multiple communities to organise mining operations and protect valuable resources. Similarly, the development of pottery production centres at Athens and other locations benefited from coordinated access to clay sources and distribution networks that extended beyond individual community territories. The archaeological evidence from 9th century Athens reveals the physical infrastructure that supported emerging political consolidation. The settlement on the Acropolis expanded significantly during this period, with new houses and workshops indicating population growth and increased economic activity. The development of the Agora area northwest of the Acropolis provided space for assemblies, markets, and religious activities that served the broader Attic community rather than just the immediate urban population. The emergence of Agora spaces represents a crucial development in the evolution of polis institutions. These open areas, typically located at the intersection of major routes or in naturally level areas suitable for large gatherings, served multiple functions that supported community governance and economic activity. The Agora provided venues for political assemblies where community decisions were made through collective discussion and voting procedures that replaced the autocratic decision-making of the palatial period. The physical layout of early Agora spaces reflects their multifunctional character and the egalitarian principles that governed Dark Age political institutions. Unlike the restricted palace courtyards that had served as ceremonial spaces during the Bronze Age, Agoras were designed as public areas accessible to all community members. The open design facilitated large gatherings, while the central location ensured convenient access from all parts of the settlement. The development of market functions within Agora spaces supported the economic growth that made political consolidation possible. The regular gathering of community members for political assemblies created opportunities for economic exchange that gradually evolved into formal market activities. Farmers could sell surplus produce, craftsmen could display their wares, and traders could offer goods from other communities, creating economic relationships that reinforced political bonds. Archaeological evidence from the Athenian Agora reveals the gradual development of infrastructure supporting these multiple functions. Simple altars and boundary stones marked sacred areas used for religious ceremonies and oath-taking that sanctified political decisions. Wells and fountains provided water for large gatherings, while temporary shelters offered protection from weather during extended assemblies. The accumulation of pottery sherds and other debris in specific areas indicates the establishment of regular market activities by the 8th century BC. The emergence of specialised civic buildings within or adjacent to agora spaces reflects the increasing complexity of polis institutions during the 8th century BC. Simple structures served as meeting places for councils of elders or other governing bodies that required private deliberation spaces separate from public assemblies. Storage buildings housed community resources including weapons, religious equipment, and records of legal decisions that required secure preservation. The development at Argos illustrates the transformation of Dark Age settlements into proto-urban centres during the 8th century BC. The community that had developed around the Heraean sanctuary gradually expanded to encompass multiple settlement clusters connected by religious and economic relationships. The establishment of regular festivals honouring Hera created occasions for inter-community gathering that facilitated political cooperation and economic exchange. The Argive settlement pattern reveals how religious centres could serve as focal points for political consolidation. The Heraeon provided neutral ground where representatives from different communities could meet without acknowledging the political supremacy of any single settlement. The sanctuary's wealth, accumulated through generations of votive offerings, provided resources that could support community projects requiring coordinated investment. The archaeological evidence from 8th century Corinth demonstrates another model of proto-urban development based on strategic location and economic opportunity. The settlement's position controlling the narrow isthmus between the Peloponnese and central Greece provided opportunities for trade and transportation services that attracted population from throughout the region. The development of pottery production using local clay sources created export industries that generated wealth supporting urban growth. The Corinthian settlement developed distinctive characteristics that reflected its commercial orientation. The Agora area incorporated facilities specifically designed for trade activities, including storage buildings, workshops, and temporary shelters for visiting merchants. The community's religious centres emphasised deities associated with commerce and navigation, particularly Poseidon and Aphrodite, whose cults attracted worshippers from throughout the Greek world. The physical infrastructure supporting these emerging proto-urban centres required coordinated community investment that demonstrated the effectiveness of synoecism processes. The construction of roads connecting scattered settlements, the development of water supply systems serving larger populations, and the establishment of defensive arrangements protecting extended territories all required cooperative efforts that transcended traditional community boundaries. The evidence for road construction during the 8th century BC appears most clearly in the countryside around major centres like Athens and Corinth. These routes, typically marked by stone markers and maintained through community labour obligations, facilitated communication and trade between previously isolated settlements. The road systems also enabled coordinated military responses to external threats, providing strategic advantages that justified the investment in infrastructure development. Water supply systems developed during this period reveal sophisticated engineering capabilities that had been lost during the early Dark Age period, but were gradually recovered through practical experimentation and inter-community cooperation. The fountain houses and aqueducts that supplied 8th century settlements incorporated techniques derived from both Bronze Age precedents and contemporary innovations adapted to local conditions. The defensive arrangements that protected emerging polis communities created the foundation for profound social transformations that would reshape Greek civilization. As the elaborate palace hierarchies of the Mycenaean world crumbled into dust, new forms of social organization emerged from the chaos, centered not on bureaucratic administrators or divine kings, but on warrior chiefs who commanded through personal prowess and the loyalty of armed followers. These basileis, as they came to be known, represented a fundamental departure from Bronze Age social structures, establishing their authority through martial excellence and the ability to provide protection and leadership to scattered communities struggling to survive in an increasingly dangerous world. The Linear B tablets from Pylos reveal the complexity of Mycenaean social hierarchy, with its elaborate distinctions between the Wanaks, Lauagetas, Telestas, and various categories of dependent personnel. This system had operated through written regulations, standardized procedures, and institutional continuity that transcended individual personalities. Palace scribes maintained detailed records of social obligations, land tenure arrangements, and hierarchical relationships that governed interactions between different social groups. The destruction of this administrative apparatus eliminated not merely the records, but the entire conceptual framework that had structured Mycenaean society. The collapse of palatial authority created a social vacuum that could only be filled through personal leadership and direct relationships between individuals. In the absence of written laws, established institutions, and hereditary bureaucracies, authority devolved to those individuals capable of commanding respect through their own actions and abilities. The warrior chiefs who emerged during this period established their legitimacy not through inherited office or institutional appointment, but through demonstrated competence in warfare, leadership, and the protection of their followers. Archaeological evidence from Dark Age settlements reveals the material basis for this new form of social organisation. The elaborate palace complexes with their specialised workshops, storage facilities, and administrative quarters gave way to much simpler residential structures that reflected a fundamentally different approach to social hierarchy. The houses of emerging aristocrats, while larger and better constructed than those of ordinary community members, remained relatively modest structures that emphasised functionality over display. These buildings typically incorporated features that demonstrated their owner's martial character, weapon storage areas, stables for horses, and guest facilities for entertaining armed followers. The settlement at Lefkandi provides exceptional evidence for the emergence of aristocratic households during the 10th century BC. The massive apsidal building that dominated the site measured over 45 metres in length and contained elaborate burials accompanied by spectacular grave goods, including gold jewellery, bronze vessels, ivory objects, and sacrificed horses. The structure's size and construction quality required coordinated labour from multiple communities, demonstrating the ability of its owners to command resources and manpower on a scale that approached palatial levels despite the absence of formal administrative systems. The burial assemblage within the Lefkandi building reveals the values and aspirations of Dark Age aristocracy. The male burial contained an iron sword with gold and ivory decoration, bronze spearheads, and a whetstone that emphasised the deceased's identity as a warrior. The female burial included elaborate gold jewellery, bronze vessels, and ivory seals that demonstrated wealth and status, while avoiding the administrative symbolism that had characterised Mycenaean elite burials. The inclusion of 4 sacrificed horses provided the deceased with the means for heroic transportation in the afterlife, while demonstrating the household's wealth and the community's willingness to sacrifice valuable resources to honour their leader. The transformation of social relationships from institutional to personal bonds fundamentally altered how authority was exercised and maintained within Greek communities. Mycenaean rulers had governed through established procedures and delegated authority, relying on written records and professional administrators to manage complex territorial states. The basiles of the Dark Age period commanded through direct personal relationships with their followers, maintaining loyalty through gift-giving, shared military adventures, and the provision of protection and leadership in times of crisis. The development of the oikos as the fundamental unit of social and economic organisation represented one of the most significant innovations of the Dark Age period. These aristocratic households functioned as largely self-sufficient economic enterprises that combined agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and military organisation under the authority of a single dominant male figure. The oikos included not only the basileus and his immediate family, but also dependent workers, craftsmen, and warriors who owed personal loyalty to the household head in exchange for protection, sustenance, and opportunities for advancement. The physical layout of aristocratic oikoi reflected their multifunctional character and the personal nature of authority relationships within them. Archaeological evidence from sites like Nicoria reveals house complexes that incorporated residential quarters, workshops, storage facilities, and areas for entertaining guests and followers. The central Megaron-style hall served as the focal point for communal activities, providing space for feasting, deliberation, and the reception of visitors that reinforced the basileus's position as leader and patron of his extended household. The economic foundation of aristocratic power rested on the control of agricultural land and the labour necessary to work it effectively. The fertile valleys and coastal plains that had supported Mycenaean palace economies became the territorial bases for competing aristocratic households that established their authority through the ability to organise agricultural production and defend their territories against external threats. The basileus who controlled these resources could support larger households, maintain more followers, and exercise greater influence within their communities than those dependent on marginal lands or limited resources. The role of warfare in establishing and maintaining aristocratic authority cannot be overstated. The collapse of centralized military organizations left individual communities vulnerable to attack from raiders, rival groups, and displaced populations seeking new territories. The basileis who could provide effective military leadership and organize successful defensive efforts gained the loyalty and support of community members who depended on their protection for survival. This military function provided the fundamental justification for aristocratic authority and the resource extraction necessary to maintain armed followers. Cattle raiding emerged as a crucial activity that both demonstrated aristocratic prowess and provided the material foundation for maintaining warrior bands. The archaeological evidence reveals that livestock represented the primary form of movable wealth during the Dark Age period, serving both as a store of value and a means of displaying status and success. Successful raids against neighbouring communities or nomadic groups provided aristocratic leaders with the resources necessary to reward their followers, expand their households, and demonstrate their effectiveness as military commanders. The practice of cattle raiding required sophisticated organisational skills and military expertise that distinguished successful basileis from ordinary warriors. Planning and executing successful raids demanded knowledge of terrain, enemy capabilities, and seasonal patterns that affected both the availability of targets and the likelihood of successful operations. The leaders who developed these skills attracted followers seeking opportunities for advancement and material gain, creating the personal bonds that form the foundation of aristocratic authority. The distribution of raid spoils provided aristocratic leaders with crucial opportunities to demonstrate their generosity and maintain the loyalty of their followers. The basileis who proved most successful at acquiring wealth through raiding and most generous in sharing the proceeds with their warriors attracted the largest and most effective military followings. This created competitive pressures that encouraged aggressive military activities and the development of increasingly sophisticated warfare techniques. Archaeological evidence for the importance of warfare in Dark Age society appears most clearly in burial assemblages that emphasize martial identity and military equipment. The graves of aristocratic warriors typically contained multiple weapons, swords, spears, daggers, and sometimes shields that demonstrated their owners' military roles and social status. The quality and decoration of these weapons reflected both the wealth of their owners and the importance of martial excellence in establishing social position. The iron swords found in aristocratic burials represent significant technological and social developments that distinguish Dark Age warfare from Bronze Age military practices. These weapons, while initially cruder than their bronze predecessors, offered advantages in terms of availability and durability that made them increasingly effective tools of war. The gradual improvement in ironworking techniques during the 10th and 9th centuries BC produced weapons of exceptional quality that became symbols of aristocratic status and military prowess. The emergence of horse-related equipment in aristocratic burials reflects another significant development in Dark Age warfare and social display. Bronze horse bits, harness fittings, and other equestrian equipment appear with increasing frequency in 9th and 8th century graves, indicating the growing importance of mounted warfare and the social prestige associated with horse ownership. The ability to maintain war horses required substantial resources and demonstrated the wealth and status of their owners, while providing significant military advantages in both raiding and defensive operations. The social stratification that developed during the Dark Age period manifested most clearly in differential access to imported goods and luxury materials that demonstrated wealth and international connections. While the elaborate trade networks of the Bronze Age had collapsed, limited commercial contacts persisted throughout the Dark Age period, providing aristocratic households with access to exotic materials that served as markers of status and distinction. The appearance of amber from northern Europe, ivory from Africa, and precious metals from various sources in aristocratic contexts demonstrates the persistence of long-distance exchange relationships despite overall economic decline. The control of craft production within aristocratic oikoi provided another mechanism for social differentiation and the accumulation of wealth and status symbols. Archaeological evidence reveals that the finest pottery, metalwork, and textile production during the Dark Age period occurred within aristocratic household contexts rather than in specialized workshops serving broader markets. The basileus who controlled skilled craftsmen could produce the high-quality goods necessary for gift exchange, religious offerings, and personal display that reinforced their social position. The development of guest friendship relationships between aristocratic households created networks of mutual obligation and support that transcended local community boundaries. These xenia relationships, formalized through gift exchange and ritual hospitality, provided aristocratic leaders with allies and supporters throughout the Greek world, while creating opportunities for trade, information exchange, and military cooperation. The maintenance of guest friendship networks required substantial resources and diplomatic skills that distinguished successful aristocratic leaders from those who remained locally focused. Housing patterns during the Dark Age period reveal clear evidence of social stratification based on wealth, status, and access to resources. The houses of aristocratic families typically featured superior construction techniques, larger floor plans, and more elaborate architectural details than those of ordinary community members. These differences reflected not only economic disparities, but also the social expectations associated with aristocratic status and the need to provide appropriate settings for entertaining followers and guests. The construction techniques employed in aristocratic housing demonstrate access to skilled craftsmen and superior materials that ordinary households could not afford. Stone foundations, timber framing, and tile roofing appeared first in aristocratic contexts, before gradually spreading to other social levels. The investment in permanent high-quality construction reflected both the wealth of aristocratic households and their expectation of maintaining their social position over multiple generations. The internal organisation of aristocratic houses reveals the complex social relationships that characterise Dark Age oikoi. Large central halls provided space for communal activities, feasting, and the reception of visitors that reinforced the household head's position as leader and patron. Specialised storage areas housed weapons, valuable goods, and agricultural surpluses that demonstrated wealth, while providing the material foundation for maintaining followers and dependents. Private quarters for the basileus and his family reflected the hierarchical nature of household organisation, while providing appropriate settings for the intimate social relationships that bound the oikos together. The archaeological evidence for differential access to imported materials reveals the extent of social stratification that had developed by the 8th century BC. Aristocratic burials and household contexts contained significantly higher proportions of exotic goods, amber jewellery, ivory objects, precious metal ornaments, and fine pottery than those associated with ordinary community members. These disparities demonstrate not only economic differences, but also the social networks and exchange relationships that aristocratic households maintained with distant communities and trading partners. The emergence of specialised burial practices for aristocratic families reflects both their wealth and their distinct social identity within Dark Age communities. Aristocratic graves typically featured more elaborate construction, richer grave goods, and more prominent locations than those of ordinary individuals. The investment in impressive burial monuments served multiple functions, honouring the deceased while demonstrating family wealth and establishing permanent markers of aristocratic presence within community territories. The practice of weapon burial in aristocratic graves served important social functions, beyond simply providing the deceased with equipment for the afterlife. The deposition of valuable weapons removed them from circulation, while demonstrating the wealth and military identity of the deceased and his family. The quality and quantity of weapons in aristocratic burials also served as public displays of the military capabilities that had established and maintained the family's social position. The development of hereditary claims to aristocratic status represents a crucial transition from the purely personal authority of early Dark Age basileus to the more institutionalized aristocracy of the later period. The sons and grandsons of successful warrior leaders began claiming positions of authority based on their ancestry rather than solely on their personal achievements. This transition required the development of genealogical traditions and inheritance practices that could legitimate aristocratic claims across generations while maintaining the military effectiveness that justified aristocratic authority. The genealogical traditions that legitimized aristocratic claims to hereditary status developed alongside revolutionary changes in technology and material culture that transformed daily life throughout the Greek world. The transition from bronze to iron working represented far more than a simple substitution of materials. It constituted a fundamental transformation in how communities organized production, distributed resources, and conceptualized their relationship with the material world. The democratization of metal technology that accompanied iron adoption undermined traditional elite monopolies over weapon production, while simultaneously enabling agricultural innovations that supported population growth and territorial expansion. The earliest iron objects in Greek contexts date to the late 12th century BC and reveal the experimental nature of early iron working techniques. These primitive implements, often little more than roughly shaped pieces of wrought iron, demonstrate that Greek craftsmen initially possessed only rudimentary knowledge of iron metallurgy. The metal was typically worked cold or at relatively low temperatures, producing tools and weapons that were brittle, prone to corrosion, and inferior in many respects to their bronze counterparts. Archaeological analysis of these early iron artifacts reveals high slag content, irregular carbon distribution, and poor consolidation that resulted from inadequate understanding of the complex relationship between temperature, time, and atmospheric conditions required for effective ironworking. The gradual improvement in ironworking techniques during the 11th and 10th centuries BC reflects accumulated practical experience rather than sudden technological breakthroughs. Greek smiths learned through trial and error how to achieve the higher temperatures necessary for effective ironworking, developing furnace designs that could reach the 1200 to 1500 degrees Celsius, required for proper smelting and forging operations. The construction of these improved furnaces required sophisticated understanding of airflow, fuel consumption, and heat retention that could only be acquired through generations of experimentation and refinement. The development of carburization techniques during the 10th century BC marked a crucial advancement in iron technology that began to produce weapons and tools superior to bronze equivalents. Greek smiths discovered that prolonged heating of iron in contact with carbon-rich materials could produce steel with enhanced hardness and durability. This process, initially achieved accidentally through the use of charcoal fuel and organic packing materials, was gradually refined into deliberate procedures that could produce predictable results. Archaeological examination of 9th century iron weapons reveals increasingly consistent carbon content and improved metallurgical structure that demonstrates mastery of these complex techniques. The impact of iron technology on agricultural production proved revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond simple tool substitution. Iron ploughshares could penetrate heavy clay soils that had been difficult or impossible to cultivate using bronze implements, opening vast new areas for agricultural exploitation. The superior edge retention of iron tools reduced the labour required for land clearance, enabling communities to expand cultivation into forested areas that had previously been considered unsuitable for farming. The durability of iron implements also reduced replacement costs and maintenance requirements, freeing agricultural labour for productive activities rather than tool manufacturing and repair. Archaeological evidence from agricultural sites throughout Greece reveals dramatic expansion of cultivated areas during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, coinciding with the widespread adoption of iron agricultural tools. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows significant deforestation and the appearance of cereal crops in regions that had supported only wild vegetation during the early Dark Age period. The expansion of agriculture into marginal lands enabled communities to support larger populations while reducing dependence on imported food supplies that had been disrupted by the collapse of Bronze Age trade networks. The development of iron agricultural tools also facilitated innovations in farming techniques that increased productivity per unit of cultivated land. Iron-tipped ploughs could create deeper furrows that improved soil aeration and water retention, while iron hoes and mattocks enabled more thorough cultivation of existing fields. The superior cutting ability of iron sickles and scythes reduced harvest time and labour requirements, allowing communities to cultivate larger areas with the same workforce. These improvements in agricultural efficiency provided the economic foundation for the population growth and territorial expansion that characterised the later Dark Age period. The democratisation of weapon production that accompanied iron adoption had profound implications for military organisation and social structure. Bronze weapons had required access to tin, a rare metal available only through long-distance trade networks controlled by palace administrations or wealthy elites. The production of bronze swords, spears, and armour had been concentrated in specialised workshops that served aristocratic patrons and maintained quality standards through guild-like organisations. Iron weapons, by contrast, could be produced by local smiths using readily available raw materials, eliminating elite monopolies over military equipment and enabling broader participation in warfare. The archaeological record reveals dramatic increases in the number of weapons deposited in graves during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, indicating that iron technology had made military equipment accessible to much larger segments of the population. Simple iron spearheads and knives appear in the graves of ordinary farmers and craftsmen who would never have possessed bronze weapons during the glacial period. This democratization of military equipment contributed to the development of citizen soldier armies that would characterize Greek warfare during the Archaic and Classical periods. The transition to iron weapons also influenced tactical developments that would reshape Greek military practices. Iron spearheads could be produced in larger sizes and more elaborate forms than their bronze predecessors, enabling the development of longer, more effective thrusting spears that became the primary weapons of hoplite infantry. The superior penetrating power of iron weapons encouraged the development of improved defensive equipment, including bronze and iron armour that provided better protection against the enhanced offensive capabilities of iron-armed warriors. The pottery production that flourished during the Dark Age period underwent equally dramatic technological and stylistic transformations that reflected both practical innovations and changing aesthetic sensibilities. The crude hand-made ceramics of the early post-glacial period gradually gave way to wheel-thrown vessels that demonstrated renewed technical competence and artistic sophistication. The reintroduction of the potter's wheel during the 10th century BC enabled craftsmen to produce vessels with regular forms, consistent wall thickness, and smooth surfaces that marked a significant improvement over the irregular handmade pottery of the 11th century. The development of the protogeometric pottery style during the 10th century BC represented a revolutionary departure from both Mycenaean ceramic traditions and the crude pottery of the early Dark Age period. Protogeometric potters employed compass-drawn circles, semicircles, and linear patterns executed with mathematical precision that created decorative schemes of remarkable geometric regularity. The technical execution of these designs required specialized tools, steady hands, and aesthetic sensibilities that demonstrated the revival of sophisticated craft traditions after centuries of decline. The protogeometric style originated in Athens during the mid-10th century BC and spread throughout the Greek world over the following century, indicating the re-establishment of cultural connections between communities that had been isolated during the early Dark Age period. The consistency of protogeometric decorative motifs across widely separated regions suggests either direct contact between pottery workshops or the movement of skilled craftsmen who carried technical knowledge and artistic traditions from community to community. The evolution from protogeometric to geometric pottery during the 9th century BC reflected increasing artistic confidence and technical sophistication that paralleled broader cultural developments. Geometric potters expanded their decorative repertoires to include complex meander patterns, elaborate animal friezes, and eventually human figures arranged in narrative scenes. The famous Dipylon amphora from late 8th century Athens demonstrates the culmination of this artistic development, featuring sophisticated figured scenes that rival contemporary sculptural work in their complexity and execution. The technical innovations that enabled geometric pottery production required advances in kiln design, firing techniques, and clay preparation that represented significant achievements in ceramic technology. Geometric potters developed kilns capable of achieving consistent temperatures and controlled atmospheric conditions that produced the clear colour contrasts and smooth surfaces characteristic of the style. The preparation of clay bodies involved careful selection and processing of raw materials to achieve the fine textures and workability required for thin-walled vessels and precise decorative work. The standardization of vessel forms during the geometric period indicates the development of pottery workshops that served broader markets than the household-based production systems of the early Dark Age period. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing uniformity in the shapes and proportions of common vessel types, amphora, craters, cups, and bowls across different regions of Greece. This standardization suggests either the emergence of interregional trade in pottery or the establishment of common technical traditions that governed production standards throughout the Greek world. The decorative programs of geometric pottery reflect not only artistic developments, but also changing social values and cultural priorities. The emphasis on geometric patterns and mathematical precision may have reflected religious beliefs about cosmic order and divine proportion that influenced contemporary temple architecture and religious practices. The later addition of figured scenes depicting funerals, battles, and mythological narratives demonstrates the use of pottery as a medium for storytelling and cultural transmission that complemented the oral traditions maintained by professional bards. The production of large ceremonial vessels during the geometric period required technical skills and organizational capabilities that approached industrial levels of sophistication. The massive Dipylon amphora, standing over 1.5 meters in height, required specialized kilns, carefully controlled firing procedures, and coordinated labor that could only be achieved by workshops with substantial resources and technical expertise. The investment in such elaborate vessels demonstrates both the wealth of their patrons and the technical capabilities of contemporary pottery workshops. The revival of shipbuilding during the Dark Age period enabled the re-establishment of maritime connections that had been severed by the Bronze Age collapse. The earliest post-glacial vessels were simple rowing boats designed for coastal navigation and short-distance transportation of people and goods. Archaeological evidence for these early ships comes primarily from pottery representations and scattered finds of bronze ship fittings that indicate the continuation of maritime activities despite overall economic decline. The gradual improvement in shipbuilding techniques during the 10th and 9th centuries BC reflects both technological innovation and accumulated practical experience. Greek shipwrights developed hull designs that balanced seaworthiness with cargo capacity, creating vessels capable of longer voyages while remaining suitable for beach launching and recovery. The adoption of sail technology supplemented rowing power and enabled more efficient long-distance travel, though early sails were probably simple square-rigged arrangements suitable only for following winds. The development of specialised vessel types during the 8th century BC indicates the growing sophistication of Greek maritime technology and the increasing importance of seaborne trade and communication. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of distinct designs for warships, cargo vessels, and fishing boats that reflected different functional requirements and operational parameters. Warships emphasized speed and maneuverability, featuring narrow hulls and large crews of rowers, while cargo vessels prioritized carrying capacity and seaworthiness for long-distance commercial voyages. The navigation techniques employed by Dark Age seafarers combined traditional knowledge preserved from the Bronze Age period with practical innovations developed through experience. Greek navigators relied primarily on coastal pilotage, following familiar shorelines and using prominent landmarks for position fixing. The knowledge of seasonal wind patterns, current systems, and weather signs enabled experienced navigators to plan voyages that took advantage of favourable conditions while avoiding dangerous weather and sea states. The development of improved anchoring systems during this period enabled Greek ships to operate more effectively in exposed anchorages and unfamiliar waters. Archaeological finds of iron anchors with improved holding power and more durable construction demonstrate technological advances that enhanced maritime safety and operational capability. The ability to anchor securely in open roadsteads expanded the range of harbours that could be utilised and reduced dependence on protected natural harbours that might be controlled by hostile communities. The agricultural innovations of the Dark Age period extended beyond improved tools to encompass new crops and cultivation techniques that increase productivity and dietary diversity. The intensification of cereal cultivation involved the development of improved varieties of wheat and barley that were better adapted to local soil and climatic conditions. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities reveals increasing quantities of processed grain that indicate both expanded production and more efficient processing techniques. The expansion of olive cultivation during the 9th and 8th centuries BC represented a crucial development that would fundamentally shape Greek agricultural and economic systems. Olive trees required several years to reach productive maturity, but then provided reliable annual harvests that could be processed into oil for cooking, lighting, and export. The establishment of olive groves represented long-term investment in agricultural infrastructure that demonstrated confidence in territorial security and economic stability. The techniques for olive processing improved significantly during this period, with archaeological evidence revealing increasingly sophisticated oil extraction equipment. Stone olive presses capable of applying controlled pressure to crushed olives enabled more efficient oil extraction while maintaining quality standards necessary for storage and trade. The development of standardized storage vessels for olive oil facilitated commercial exchange and enabled communities to accumulate surpluses that could support population growth and economic diversification. The expansion of grape cultivation and wine production during the 8th century BC provided Greek communities with another valuable agricultural product that served both domestic consumption and export markets. The cultivation of grapes required different agricultural techniques than cereal production, involving terracing of hillsides, pruning of vines, and seasonal labour patterns that complemented grain farming activities. The processing of grapes into wine required specialised equipment and technical knowledge that represented significant advances in agricultural technology. The development of wine storage and aging techniques enabled Greek communities to produce high-quality wines that could compete in international markets and serve as valuable trade goods. Archaeological evidence reveals increasingly sophisticated wine storage facilities, including underground chambers with controlled temperature and humidity that enabled proper aging of wine products. The standardization of wine amphorae facilitated commercial exchange and enabled the development of quality control systems that maintained product reputation in distant markets. The integration of livestock raising with cereal and tree crop production created more efficient and sustainable agricultural systems that maximize productivity while maintaining soil fertility. The use of animal manure to fertilize grain fields increased yields while providing disposal for animal waste products. The grazing of livestock on fallow fields and crop residues integrated animal husbandry with plant cultivation in ways that benefited both activities while making more efficient use of available land resources. The development of improved animal breeding techniques during this period produced livestock varieties better adapted to local conditions and human needs. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing standardization of animal sizes and characteristics that suggest selective breeding programs designed to enhance desired traits. The improvement of sheep and goat breeds for wool and milk production provided raw materials for textile manufacturing, while cattle breeding focused on draft animals capable of heavy agricultural work. The agricultural innovations that transformed Dark Age communities created the economic foundation for a remarkable flowering of oral poetry that would preserve Bronze Age memories with extraordinary fidelity while simultaneously reflecting the social realities of the emerging Greek world. The Iliad and Odyssey, composed during the 8th century BC but drawing upon centuries of bardic tradition, present a complex amalgamation of historical periods that reveals both the persistence of Bronze Age cultural memory and the creative adaptation of ancient materials to contemporary concerns. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the remarkable accuracy with which these poems preserve details of Mycenaean civilization, from the specific construction techniques of Bronze Age fortifications to the precise geography of long-abandoned settlements. The archaeological correlation between Homeric descriptions and actual Bronze Age material culture demonstrates the extraordinary effectiveness of oral transmission systems maintained by professional bards across 4 centuries of illiteracy. The boar's tusk helmet worn by Odysseus during his night raid in the Iliad corresponds precisely to actual Mycenaean helmets discovered in chamber tombs throughout Greece, complete with the elaborate construction technique involving rows of curved tusks sewn onto leather caps. These helmets disappeared from use after the Bronze Age collapse, yet the Homeric description preserves technical details that could only have been transmitted through carefully maintained oral traditions spanning multiple generations. The silver-studded sword given to Diomedes by his grandfather represents another striking example of preserved Bronze Age memory. Archaeological excavations have uncovered Mycenaean weapons featuring silver inlay work that matches the Homeric description precisely, including the specific technique of embedding silver wire into bronze surfaces to create decorative patterns. The poem's reference to the sword as an heirloom passed down through generations reflects actual Bronze Age practices of weapon inheritance documented in Linear B tablets. Yet such elaborate metalwork had become impossible to produce during the Dark Age period due to the loss of specialized craft techniques and access to precious metals. The description of Nestor's cup in the Iliad provides perhaps the most remarkable example of preserved material culture memory. The poem describes a golden vessel with doves drinking from its rim, a detail that seemed purely fantastical until archaeologists discovered an actual Mycenaean cup featuring precisely this decorative motif. The vessel, found in a shaft grave at Mycenae, displays the same combination of precious metal construction and dove imagery mentioned in the epic, demonstrating that bardic traditions had preserved accurate descriptions of specific objects for over 4 centuries after their creation. The architectural descriptions in the Homeric poems reveal equally precise preservation of Bronze Age building techniques and palatial layouts. The description of Odysseus's palace in Ithaca, with its central megaron featuring 4 columns supporting the roof around a circular hearth, corresponds exactly to excavated Mycenaean palace structures at Pylos and Tiryns. The poem's reference to the palace's elaborate drainage systems, storage chambers, and defensive arrangements reflects detailed knowledge of Bronze Age architectural practices that had been completely abandoned during the Dark Age period. The geographical knowledge preserved in the Homeric poems demonstrates the bardic tradition's remarkable ability to maintain accurate topographical information across centuries of political and demographic disruption. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad preserves Bronze Age political geography with extraordinary precision, listing settlements and kingdoms that had been abandoned or drastically reduced in importance by the time of the poem's composition. Archaeological surveys have confirmed the existence of substantial Bronze Age settlements at sites mentioned in the catalogue that were uninhabited during the 8th century BC, indicating that the bardic tradition preserved political and geographical knowledge from the glacial period. The description of Troy itself reflects accurate knowledge of Bronze Age Anatolian geography and settlement patterns. The poem's references to the city's location, its relationship to nearby rivers and mountains, and its strategic position controlling access to the Hellespont correspond closely to the actual topography of the Troad region. Archaeological excavations at Hisarlik have revealed a substantial Late Bronze Age city that matches many details mentioned in the Iliad, including massive fortification walls, a citadel commanding the surrounding plain, and evidence of destruction dating to approximately the traditional date of the Trojan War. However, the Homeric poems simultaneously reflect Dark Age social realities and material conditions that would have been familiar to 8th century audiences. The political organisation described in the epics, with its emphasis on personal relationships between basileas and their followers, mirrors the decentralised authority structures that had emerged during the post-glacial period. The absence of complex administrative systems, written records, and specialised bureaucracies in the Homeric world reflects Dark Age political conditions rather than Bronze Age governmental practices documented in Linear B archives. The material culture described in daily life scenes throughout the poems corresponds closely to archaeological evidence from Dark Age contexts rather than Bronze Age assemblages. The simple pottery vessels used for storage and cooking, the basic household furnishings, and the limited range of personal possessions mentioned in domestic scenes reflect the reduced material wealth and simplified lifestyle that characterised post-palatial Greek communities. The poem's emphasis on cattle as the primary measure of wealth mirrors Dark Age economic conditions where livestock represented the most important form of movable property. The iron weapons that appear alongside bronze implements throughout the Homeric poems reflect the transitional nature of Dark Age metallurgy rather than Bronze Age weapon technology. Archaeological evidence confirms that iron weapons had become standard equipment for Greek warriors by the 8th century BC, though bronze continued to be used for armour and ceremonial objects. The poem's casual mixture of iron and bronze weapons reflects contemporary military practices rather than historically accurate Bronze Age armament, where iron implements were extremely rare and primarily used for tools rather than weapons. The social institutions that govern Homeric society reveal the complex relationship between preserved Bronze Age memories and evolved Dark Age practices. The role of competitive feasting in maintaining elite networks reflects actual Dark Age aristocratic behaviour, documented through archaeological evidence from sites like Lefkandi and Nicoria. The elaborate banquets described in both the Iliad and Odyssey, with their emphasis on the distribution of choice meat portions according to social rank, correspond to feasting practices that had developed during the post-palatial period as mechanisms for establishing and reinforcing aristocratic authority. Archaeological evidence from Dark Age elite contexts confirms the importance of competitive feasting in maintaining social hierarchies and political relationships. Excavations at aristocratic residences reveal large central halls designed specifically for communal dining, with elaborate hearth installations capable of roasting entire animals for distribution to assembled followers. The standardized sets of drinking vessels found in these contexts indicate that formal drinking ceremonies accompanied feasting activities, creating ritualized occasions for the display of wealth, generosity, and social status. The practice of gift exchange described throughout the Homeric poems reflects fundamental Dark Age mechanisms for creating and maintaining political alliances between aristocratic households. The elaborate presents exchanged between heroes, bronze tripods, golden cups, fine textiles, and weapons correspond to actual objects found in Dark Age elite burials and sanctuary deposits. These gifts served multiple functions, demonstrating the giver's wealth and generosity, while creating reciprocal obligations that bound recipients to provide future support and cooperation. The archaeological record reveals extensive networks of gift exchange operating throughout the Dark Age Greek world, connecting aristocratic households across vast geographical distances. Prestige objects found in elite burials often originated from distant regions, indicating that aristocratic families maintained exchange relationships that transcended local community boundaries. Bronze vessels from Cyprus, amber from Northern Europe, and ivory objects from the Near East appear in Dark Age contexts throughout Greece, demonstrating the persistence of long-distance exchange networks despite overall economic decline. The institution of xenia, or guest friendship, described in the Homeric poems, provided the social framework within which these exchange relationships operated. The elaborate protocols governing the reception of strangers, the obligations of hosts to provide protection and assistance, and the reciprocal duties of guests to respect their host property and authority reflect actual Dark Age practices that enabled aristocratic families to maintain connections across the scattered Greek world. Archaeological evidence from elite residences reveals guest quarters and reception areas designed specifically for entertaining visitors from distant communities. The role of Xenia in facilitating trade and information exchange cannot be overstated. Guest friendship relationships provided travelling merchants, craftsmen and warriors with secure lodging and local protection that made long-distance travel possible despite the absence of centralised authority or formal diplomatic agreements. The networks of personal relationships created through Xenia enabled the transmission of news, technical knowledge and cultural innovations across the fragmented political landscape of the Dark Age period. The Homeric poem's treatment of divine intervention reflects the evolution of Greek religious thought during the transition from Bronze Age palace religion to Dark Age community-based worship systems. The anthropomorphic gods who intervene directly in human affairs represent a significant departure from the more abstract divine figures documented in Linear B religious texts. The personal relationships between individual heroes and specific deities mirror the intimate scale of Dark Age religious practices, where community members could expect direct divine involvement in their daily affairs rather than the elaborate mediated rituals that had characterized palatial religion. The development of hero cults during the Dark Age period influenced the Homeric presentation of legendary figures as individuals worthy of posthumous veneration and capable of continued influence in mortal affairs. The poem's emphasis on the lasting fame that heroic deeds could achieve reflects contemporary practices of honouring deceased warriors and leaders at tomb sites that became focal points for community religious activities. Archaeological evidence from hero cult sites reveals offerings of weapons, pottery and food that correspond closely to the honours described as appropriate for Homeric heroes. The competitive aspects of Homeric heroism reflect Dark Age social values that emphasised individual excellence and personal achievement as the foundations of aristocratic authority. The contests and challenges that dominate both epics, from the funeral games for Patroclus to Odysseus's bow contest, mirror actual Dark Age practices where aristocratic leaders demonstrated their superiority through public displays of skill, strength, and courage. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals dedications of athletic equipment and weapons that commemorate competitive victories and martial achievements. The agricultural activities described in the Homeric poems reveal the fundamental importance of farming in Dark Age economic life, despite the aristocratic focus of the narratives. The detailed descriptions of ploughing, harvesting and livestock management reflect intimate knowledge of agricultural practices that had evolved during the post-palatial period. The poem's emphasis on the personal involvement of aristocratic leaders in agricultural supervision mirrors archaeological evidence suggesting that Dark Age Basileus maintained direct control over farming activities rather than delegating these responsibilities to professional administrators as their Mycenaean predecessors had done. The craftsmen described in the Homeric poems reflect the simplified production systems that had developed during the Dark Age period. The individual smiths, carpenters and potters who appear in various scenes correspond to the household-based craft production documented in archaeological contexts, rather than the specialised workshop systems that had characterised Bronze Age palatial centres. The poem's emphasis on the personal relationships between craftsmen and their aristocratic patrons mirrors the dependent status of skilled workers within Dark Age oikos systems. The maritime activities described throughout both epics reflect the gradual revival of seafaring that occurred during the later Dark Age period. The detailed knowledge of navigation techniques, seasonal sailing conditions, and coastal geography preserved in the poems demonstrates the re-establishment of maritime connections that had been disrupted by the Bronze Age collapse. The ships described in the epics, with their emphasis on rowing power and beach-launching capability, correspond to vessel types documented in contemporary archaeological contexts, rather than the larger sailing ships that had dominated Bronze Age trade networks. The influence of epic poetry on emerging Greek concepts of heroism established cultural values that would persist throughout the archaic and classical periods. The Homeric emphasis on personal honour, martial excellence, and the pursuit of lasting fame created behavioural models that influenced aristocratic conduct for centuries after the poem's composition. The archaeological record reveals increasing investment in elaborate burial monuments and votive offerings that demonstrate the lasting impact of Homeric heroic ideals on Greek elite culture. The preservation of Bronze Age cultural memory within Dark Age oral traditions enabled Greek communities to maintain connections to their historical past despite the catastrophic disruptions of the post-palatial period. The bardic traditions that produce the Homeric epic serve not merely as entertainment, but as repositories of cultural knowledge that preserved essential information about Greek identity, values, and historical experience. The remarkable accuracy with which these traditions maintained technical, geographical, and cultural details across 4 centuries of illiteracy demonstrates the sophisticated memory systems developed by professional singers and their audiences. The complex relationship between historical memory and contemporary reality, reflected in the Homeric poems, reveals the creative processes through which oral traditions adapted ancient materials to serve the needs of successive generations. The bardic tradition that preserved Bronze Age memories simultaneously transformed these materials into narratives that addressed Dark Age concerns about leadership, community, and cultural identity. This dynamic interaction between preservation and innovation enabled Greek oral culture to maintain continuity with the past, while adapting to changed circumstances and evolving social needs. The dynamic interaction between preservation and innovation that characterized Homeric oral culture reached its culmination during the 8th century BC as Greek communities emerged from centuries of isolation to re-establish connections with the broader Mediterranean world. The re-establishment of trade networks, the adoption of alphabetic writing, and the first wave of colonial expansion marked the definitive end of the Dark Age period and the beginning of the remarkable cultural renaissance that would transform Greece into one of the ancient world's most influential civilizations. The documentation of renewed trade connections with the Eastern Mediterranean appears most clearly in archaeological contexts, dating to around 800 BC, when exotic goods began appearing in Greek settlements with increasing frequency after their virtual absence during the preceding centuries. Excavations at sites throughout Greece reveal the sudden reappearance of materials that had been absent since the Bronze Age collapse: ivory from Syria and Africa, amber from the Baltic regions, precious metals from Anatolia and the Black Sea, and most significantly pottery and other manufactured goods from Phoenician workshops in the Levant. These imports represent more than mere luxury consumption. They indicate the re-establishment of systematic commercial relationships that required sustained diplomatic contact, standardized exchange mechanisms, and reliable transportation networks. The Phoenician merchants who initiated these renewed contacts operated from established bases throughout the Mediterranean, including major centres at Tyre, Sidon and Byblos in the Levant, as well as colonial settlements at Carthage in North Africa and various locations in Sicily and Sardinia. These traders possessed the navigational knowledge, commercial expertise, and political connections necessary to reintegrate isolated Greek communities into Mediterranean-wide exchange networks. Archaeological evidence from Phoenician sites reveals Greek pottery appearing in Levantine contexts during the 9th century BC, indicating that commercial relationships developed gradually through mutual exploration and tentative exchange, before evolving into systematic trade partnerships. The Almina trading post in northern Syria provides crucial evidence for the mechanisms through which these renewed commercial relationships operated. Excavations at this site have revealed substantial quantities of Greek pottery dating from the 9th century BC onward, alongside Phoenician, Syrian, and other Eastern Mediterranean materials that demonstrate the cosmopolitan character of this commercial centre. The Greek pottery found at Almina includes both fine decorated vessels suitable for elite consumption and utilitarian storage containers that indicate systematic trade in agricultural products, particularly olive oil and wine. The presence of Greek pottery production debris at the site suggests that Greek craftsmen established workshops within the trading post, adapting their techniques to serve Eastern Mediterranean markets. The revival of long-distance trade required the development of improved maritime technology and navigation techniques that enabled Greek merchants to compete effectively with their Phoenician counterparts. Archaeological evidence reveals significant advances in Greek shipbuilding during the 8th century BC, including the construction of larger vessels with enhanced cargo capacity and improved seaworthiness for extended voyages. The adoption of Phoenician-influenced hull designs and rigging systems enabled Greek ships to carry larger cargoes over greater distances, while maintaining the manoeuvrability necessary for coastal navigation and beach landing in areas lacking developed harbour facilities. The standardization of weights and measures that accompanied renewed commercial activity reflects the sophisticated administrative systems that Greek communities developed to regulate trade relationships. Archaeological discoveries of bronze and stone weight standards from 8th century contexts reveal the adoption of measurement systems compatible with those used throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, enabling Greek merchants to participate in established commercial networks without requiring complex conversion procedures. The development of standardized pottery forms for storing and transporting olive oil, wine, and other liquid commodities has facilitated commercial exchange by ensuring consistent quality and quantity standards that met international market expectations. The analysis of the adoption and adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet for Greek writing around 750 BC reveals one of the most significant cultural innovations in human history. The Phoenician script, which represented only consonantal sounds, proved inadequate for accurately recording Greek speech, with its complex vowel systems and inflectional grammar. Greek scribes who learned the Phoenician alphabet made the revolutionary decision to employ certain consonantal signs that represented sounds absent from Greek to indicate vowel sounds, creating the world's first true alphabet capable of representing both consonants and vowels with individual symbols. The earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions appear on pottery vessels from Italian sites, particularly Pithecusae and Cumae, where Greek colonists encountered Phoenician traders during the mid-8th century BC. These early inscriptions, often consisting of personal names, ownership marks, or brief dedicatory formulas, demonstrate that alphabetic literacy initially served practical, commercial, and social functions, rather than literary or administrative purposes. The famous Nestor's Cup inscription from Pithecusae, dating to around 740 BC, represents one of the earliest examples of Greek alphabetic writing used for poetic composition, suggesting that the new script quickly found applications beyond simple record-keeping. The adaptation process involved significant modifications to the Phoenician script that reflected both practical considerations and aesthetic preferences. Greek scribes altered the orientation of several letters, standardized character forms that had varied considerably in Phoenician usage, and developed consistent conventions for letter spacing and line arrangement that enhanced readability. The creation of distinct letter forms for vowel sounds required careful consideration of phonetic relationships and sound patterns that demonstrate sophisticated linguistic analysis by early Greek scribes. The regional variations that developed in early Greek alphabetic writing reflect the decentralized nature of script adoption and the independent experimentation conducted by different communities. The Euboean alphabet, which influenced colonial scripts in Italy and Sicily, differed significantly from the Attic version that would eventually become standard throughout the Greek world. These variations involved not only different letter forms, but also alternative approaches to representing certain sounds, particularly the distinction between long and short vowels that posed challenges for accurate transcription of Greek speech. The impact of alphabetic literacy on Greek cultural development cannot be overstated. The ability to record and preserve texts enabled the standardization of legal codes, religious practices, and poetic traditions that had previously existed only in oral form. The earliest alphabetic inscriptions of laws dating to the 7th century BC demonstrate how writing technology transformed governmental procedures by creating permanent records of legal decisions and procedural requirements that could be consulted by citizens and officials alike. The preservation of epic poetry through alphabetic transcription ensured the survival of Homeric traditions, while simultaneously fixing narrative versions that had previously remained flexible in oral performance. The examination of the first wave of Greek colonization to southern Italy and Sicily, beginning in the 8th century BC, reveals the complex motivations and sophisticated organizational capabilities that characterized this remarkable expansion movement. The establishment of colonies at sites like Pithecusae, Cumae, Syracuse, and Tarentum represented more than simple population overflow from overcrowded mainland communities. These settlements constituted carefully planned enterprises that required substantial investment, detailed geographical knowledge, and complex negotiations with indigenous populations. The colony at Pithecusae, established around 770 BC on the island of Ischia in the Bay of Naples, provides exceptional evidence for the early phases of Greek colonial activity. Archaeological excavations have revealed a thriving community engaged in metalworking, pottery production, and long-distance trade that connected the Western Mediterranean with markets in Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. The discovery of substantial ironworking installations at the site indicates that the colonists exploited local iron ore deposits to produce tools and weapons for both local use and export to other communities. The presence of Phoenician traders and craftsmen alongside Greek colonists demonstrates the cosmopolitan character of these early settlements and their integration into broader Mediterranean commercial networks. The selection of colonial sites reveals sophisticated understanding of geographical, economic, and strategic factors that would determine settlement success. Syracuse, established by Corinthian colonists around 734 BC, occupied a naturally fortified peninsula with excellent harbour facilities and access to fertile agricultural land in the Sicilian interior. The site's position enabled control of maritime traffic between the eastern and western Mediterranean, while providing defensive advantages against both seaborne attacks and land-based threats from indigenous populations. The rapid growth of Syracuse into one of the most powerful cities in the Greek world demonstrates the effectiveness of this site selection process. The organisational requirements for successful colonisation involved complex preparations that extended far beyond simple transportation of colonists to their destination sites. Colonial expeditions required advanced reconnaissance to identify suitable locations, negotiations with indigenous populations to secure territorial rights, and careful planning of initial settlement layouts to ensure defensibility and future expansion possibilities. The appointment of oikists, or colonial founders, who possessed the authority to make crucial decisions about land distribution, legal systems, and political organisation, demonstrates the sophisticated governmental procedures that Greek communities had developed by the 8th century BC. The relationship between mother cities and their colonies reveals the political innovations that emerged from colonial experience. Unlike later imperial systems that maintained direct administrative control over distant territories, Greek colonies typically established independent political institutions while maintaining cultural and religious connections with their founding communities. This system enabled colonial settlements to adapt their governmental procedures to local conditions while preserving essential elements of Greek identity and cultural practice. The economic motivations for colonisation involved both the acquisition of new resources and the expansion of market opportunities for Greek products. The fertile agricultural lands of Sicily and southern Italy enabled colonial communities to produce grain surpluses that could be exported to support growing populations in mainland Greece. The development of specialised agricultural production, particularly the cultivation of grapes and olives in regions with favourable climatic conditions, created export industries that generated wealth supporting urban development and cultural activities. The interaction between Greek colonists and indigenous populations produced complex patterns of cultural exchange that influenced both groups. Archaeological evidence from colonial sites reveals the adoption of local pottery styles, architectural techniques, and agricultural practices by Greek settlers, while indigenous communities incorporated Greek technological innovations, artistic motifs, and religious practices into their own cultural systems. The development of hybrid cultural forms in colonial contexts demonstrates the creative potential of cross-cultural contact and the adaptability of Greek cultural institutions. The investigation of the emergence of the Olympic Games, with their traditional date of 776 BC, reveals the development of Pan-Hellenic institutions that transcended local political boundaries and created shared cultural experiences for Greek communities throughout the Mediterranean world. While the conventional date represents later chronographic calculations, rather than definitively historical records, archaeological evidence confirms that organised athletic competitions began developing at Olympia during the 8th century BC as part of broader patterns of religious and cultural revival. The sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia provides crucial evidence for the evolution of Pan-Hellenic religious institutions during the later Dark Age period. Archaeological excavations have revealed continuous ritual activity at the site from the 10th century BC onward, with gradually increasing quantities and quality of votive offerings that reflect growing prosperity and wider participation in sanctuary activities. The development of permanent facilities for athletic competitions, including running tracks, wrestling areas, and spectator accommodations, required coordinated investment by multiple communities that demonstrates the emergence of inter-regional cooperation and shared cultural values. The athletic competitions that developed at Olympia reflected aristocratic values and military training practices that had evolved during the Dark Age period. The original Olympic events, foot races, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and the pentathlon emphasise physical capabilities essential for warfare, while providing peaceful outlets for competitive instincts that might otherwise lead to destructive conflicts between communities. The emphasis on individual achievement and public recognition of excellence create incentives for athletic training and competition that contributed to the physical fitness and military effectiveness of Greek populations. The religious framework within which Olympic competition operated integrated athletic activities with worship practices that honoured Zeus while celebrating human excellence and divine favour. The elaborate sacrificial ceremonies that accompanied the games created opportunities for representatives from throughout the Greek world to participate in shared religious experiences that reinforced cultural unity despite political fragmentation. The sacred truce that protected participants travelling to and from Olympia established precedents for inter-community cooperation that would influence later developments in Greek international relations. The expansion of Olympic participation beyond local Peloponnesian communities during the 8th and 7th centuries BC reflects the growing integration of Greek settlements throughout the Mediterranean world. The appearance of victors from colonial communities in Italy and Sicily, alongside competitors from mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands, demonstrates that Pan-Hellenic institutions successfully adapted to the geographical expansion of Greek civilization. The standardization of competition rules and victory recognition procedures created shared standards of excellence that transcended local variations in training methods and competitive traditions. The development of other Pan-Hellenic festivals during this period, including the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Nemean Games, and the Isthmian Games at Corinth, created a circuit of religious and athletic activities that provided regular opportunities for inter-community contact and cultural exchange. These festivals combined athletic competitions with musical contests, religious ceremonies, and commercial activities that served multiple functions in promoting Greek cultural unity and economic integration. The scheduling of major festivals at different times throughout the year ensured continuous opportunities for travel and cultural exchange that maintained connections between distant communities. The establishment of oracular consultation at Delphi during the 8th century BC created another crucial Pan-Hellenic institution that provided guidance for colonial expeditions, legal disputes, and religious questions that transcended local community capabilities. The Pythian priestess who delivered Apollo's oracular responses drew upon extensive networks of information and consultation that enabled informed advice on complex political and religious matters. The prestige and authority of Delphic oracles influenced decision-making processes throughout the Greek world and contributed to the standardization of religious practices and legal procedures. The archaeological evidence for cultural revival during the 8th century BC extends beyond religious and athletic institutions to encompass artistic, technological, and intellectual developments that establish foundations for the remarkable achievements of archaic and classical Greek civilization. The geometric pottery that reached its full development during this period demonstrates artistic sophistication and technical competence that rivaled the finest products of contemporary Eastern Mediterranean workshops. The figured scenes that appeared on late geometric vessels reveal narrative capabilities and artistic ambitions that would evolve into the sophisticated sculptural and painting traditions of later periods. The development of monumental sculpture during the late 8th century BC marked the beginning of artistic traditions that would profoundly influence Western art for millennia. The earliest Greek sculptural works, influenced by Egyptian and Near Eastern models but adapted to Greek aesthetic preferences and religious requirements, demonstrated technical capabilities and artistic vision that had been absent from Greek culture since the Bronze Age collapse. The creation of cult statues, grave monuments, and architectural sculpture required specialized knowledge and substantial resources that reflected the growing prosperity and cultural confidence of Greek communities. The emergence of philosophical speculation during this period, while not yet systematized into formal schools of thought, represented crucial developments in Greek intellectual culture that would eventually produce the remarkable philosophical traditions of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The questioning of traditional mythological explanations for natural phenomena and the development of rational approaches to understanding the physical world reflected intellectual confidence and curiosity that had been nurtured by the cultural exchanges and expanded horizons of the colonial period. The technological innovations that continued throughout the 8th century BC, building upon the ironworking and agricultural developments of earlier periods, provided the material foundation for the cultural achievements of the emerging archaic period. Improvements in metallurgy, pottery production, shipbuilding and construction techniques enabled Greek communities to undertake increasingly ambitious projects while maintaining the technological competitiveness necessary for successful participation in Mediterranean-wide commercial and cultural networks. The political developments that accompanied these cultural and economic changes laid the groundwork for the polis institutions that would characterize Greek civilization throughout its classical period. The gradual consolidation of scattered Dark Age settlements into unified political communities, the development of legal codes and governmental procedures, and the establishment of citizenship concepts that balanced individual rights with collective responsibilities represented fundamental innovations in political organization that would influence governmental theory and practice throughout the ancient world and beyond. As the 8th century BC drew to a close, the Greek world had been fundamentally transformed from the isolated, impoverished communities that had struggled to survive in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. The re-establishment of trade networks had ended centuries of economic isolation and cultural stagnation. The adoption of alphabetic writing had provided the technological foundation for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge that would enable unprecedented intellectual and artistic achievements. The colonial movement had expanded Greek presence throughout the Mediterranean, while creating new forms of political organisation adapted to diverse geographical and cultural environments. The development of Pan-Hellenic institutions had created shared cultural experiences that unified scattered Greek communities while respecting their political independence and local traditions. The Dark Age period, which had begun with the catastrophic destruction of Bronze Age civilization around 1200 BC, concluded with the emergence of a new form of Greek culture that combined preserved memories of the heroic past with innovative responses to contemporary challenges and opportunities. The 4 centuries of struggle, adaptation, and gradual recovery had produced a civilization that was both distinctively Greek and remarkably adaptable to diverse circumstances and environments. The foundations established during the Dark Age period, iron technology, alphabetic literacy, polis political institutions, Pan-Hellenic religious and cultural traditions, and colonial expansion, would support the extraordinary achievements of archaic and classical Greece that continue to influence world civilization today. The transformation of Greece from the ruins of Mycenaean palaces to the vibrant communities of the early archaic period represents one of the most remarkable recoveries in human history. The Greek Dark Ages, far from being merely a period of decline and stagnation, constituted a crucial formative era that established the cultural, political, and technological foundations for one of humanity's most influential civilizations. The creativity, resilience, and adaptability demonstrated by Greek communities during these challenging centuries provided the essential groundwork for the philosophical, artistic, political, and intellectual achievements that would define Western civilization for millennia to come.